Hello, friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, if you're enjoying these stories, a like helps more than you would think. And if you want more nights like this one, waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means a great deal to me. That is the whole pitch. I will not mention it again tonight. What I would love to know is where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're in a quiet bedroom in Ohio, with a fan turning slowly in the corner, just enough to keep the warm air moving. Maybe you're tucked into the dark in Pennsylvania with the window cracked open, waiting to see if a breeze ever finds its way in. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. All right, love. Pull the sheet up just enough to feel covered, the way you would if someone else were tucking it there for you. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. It is not the white dress we're going to start with tonight, though there is a dress, hanging right now on the back of a closet door in a small house on Maple Street, sheathed in tissue paper that crackles faintly every time the door is opened. It is not the church either, though the church is real too, white clabbered with a squat little steeple, sitting at the corner of two quiet streets in a town in Ohio you have never heard of and never will. We're not going to start with the photograph that this day will eventually become, the one that gets framed, the one that sits on a mantelpiece for the next 40 years. That photograph is coming. It is hours away yet. What I want to start with instead is a sound. 4:50 in the morning, the last week of June, 1953. A small house, 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 bathroom they all share, and in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, a young woman is lying perfectly still with her eyes open, listening to a clock she cannot quite see in the dark, counting backward from the hour she's supposed to be at the church. She has not slept. Not really. She dozed somewhere around 2, the kind of shallow, twitching sleep that does not actually rest you, and woke an hour later with her heart already going, already running ahead of her into a day that has not started yet. Maybe she is 21, the daughter of a man who works at the hardware store on 4th Street, and a mother who has not stopped moving since Tuesday. Maybe she is 24, older than most of her friends were when they married, and has heard, more than once this past year, the particular gentleness people use when they are quietly relieved for you. Maybe she is someone you knew once, or someone whose photograph still sits, slightly faded now, in a box in your own mother's closet. She could be any of them. That is rather the point. Here is the thing nobody put on the invitation, the thing that will not appear in the album, the thing her own children will never quite know, to ask her about decades from now when they flip through those stiff black pages with the little photo corners holding everything in place. Today is supposed to be the happiest day of her life. She has been told that so many times in the last 6 months that the phrase has started to feel less like a description and more like an instruction. And lying there in the dark, 4:50 in the morning, listening to her own pulse, she's doing the arithmetic on something she would never say out loud to a single person in her life. Not her mother, not her maid of honour. Certainly not the minister, who will ask her in roughly 9 hours whether she takes this man, and to whom she will answer yes in a voice she has been quietly rehearsing all week so that it does not shake. The arithmetic is this. She's marrying a man she has known for 14 months. A good man, by every measure the town uses to judge such things. Steady job at the plant outside town, regular at church, polite to her mother, the kind of young man other young men's mothers mention approvingly at the grocery store. She likes him. She wants to be careful here, because liking someone and what she imagined love might feel like, back when she was younger and read too many novels from the library, are not quite the same shape, and she has spent the better part of this year trying to convince herself that the difference does not matter, or does not matter enough, or is simply what grown women learn to accept. Tonight she will sleep in a house she has visited 4 times. Tonight she will become, officially, permanently, a name she was not born with, and she does not know, lying there with the ceiling barely visible above her, whether what she's feeling is nerves, which everyone assures her is normal, or something else entirely, something with no acceptable name in 1953, something closer to grief for a version of her life she will never quite get to live now, the one where she stayed unmarried a little longer, worked a little longer at the library downtown, kept her evenings to herself a little longer. She will not say any of this. Not today. Not for years. Possibly not ever. Not even to herself in those exact words. What she will do in about 40 minutes is get up, splash cold water on her face in the bathroom down the hall, and begin the long, quiet performance that an entire town is expecting of her. This is not the story you've heard about the 1950s wedding. This is not white satin glowing under stained glass, not a father's proud arm, not the toast at the reception that makes everyone a little teary. Those things are coming, and they are real, and some of them will even feel good when they arrive. But underneath all of it, behind the veil and the flowers and the borrowed pearl earrings, there is a young woman doing something enormously difficult in near total silence. And tonight, for the next several hours, I want to walk through that day with you exactly as she lived it. Not the version that ended up in the album, the other one. Her name for tonight is Eleanor. I am choosing it for her the way you might choose a name for someone you're about to spend several hours getting to know, knowing full well that the real woman behind this story had a different name. A name that belonged to a real family on a real street, and that there were thousands of her, all over the country, in that same June, in towns that looked almost identical to this one. Eleanor will do. It suits her somehow in the way certain names suit certain kinds of careful, watchful young women. To understand what Eleanor is carrying this morning, you have to understand something about how she got here, because nothing about this wedding day arrived out of nowhere. It was built slowly, over the better part of a year and a half, out of 1,000 small social transactions that a young woman in 1953 was expected to navigate with grace, and mostly without complaint. Courtship in post-war small-town America was not the casual exploratory thing it would become a generation or two later. It had rules, quiet ones, mostly unwritten, but understood by everyone the way you understand the rules of a game you grew up watching everyone else play. It began, for Eleanor, the way it began for most of her friends, with a kind of supervised proximity. A church social, a dance at the Grange Hall, an introduction made by a mutual friend, or more often, by a mother who had been quietly assessing the available young men in the congregation for some time, and had her own opinions about who might suit her daughter. Dating in this era, especially outside the larger cities, was rarely a private affair in the way we imagine privacy now. It happened in public, mostly, under a kind of soft, constant supervision. A young man would call at the house. He would sit for a little while in the front parlour or on the porch, making conversation with the girl's father about his work, about the weather, about whatever safe, neutral topic two men could discuss, while the real evaluation happened underneath the words. Was he steady? Did he have prospects? Did he drink? And if so, how much? And did he hold it well or badly? These were not romantic questions. They were practical ones, asked by a father who understood, in a way his daughter perhaps did not yet, that marriage in this world was an economic and social arrangement, as much as it was anything else, even when love happened to be present too. There is a particular detail I find myself returning to, something small that tells you almost everything about the texture of courtship in this period. The etiquette manuals of the era, and there were many of them, sold cheaply, passed between mothers and daughters, kept on a shelf next to the family Bible in more houses than you would think, were extraordinarily specific about the choreography of early courtship. A respectable young woman did not telephone a young man first. She did not write to him before he had written to her. If he called and she was not interested, she was instructed to be pleasant but brief, never cruel, because a young man's reputation in town could be quietly damaged by an unkind rejection, just as a young woman's could be damaged by an indiscretion. Everyone, it seemed, was protecting everyone else's standing all at once, in a kind of elaborate, exhausting social ballet that nobody had to be taught explicitly, because it was simply the water they had all grown up swimming in. Eleanor met him, let us call him Walter, a name as plain and dependable as the man himself seems to be, at a church picnic in April of the previous year. She remembers, even now, lying in the dark this morning, that he had spilled lemonade on his good trousers and had been so flustered about it that she had laughed before she could stop herself, and that the laugh had somehow made him relax rather than embarrass him further. and that this had felt, in the moment, like something. Not lightning. Not the thunderclap of feeling she had read about in the novels she used to check out from the library 2 and 3 at a time. Something quieter. A kind of ease. She had liked. She remembers thinking that day. How he had laughed at himself instead of getting flustered the way some men did when a girl saw them at less than their best. He called on her the following Sunday. Her father sat with them for the first 20 minutes, as was expected, and then found some reason to excuse himself to the back porch, leaving the parlour door open, because a closed door with a young man and a young woman alone behind it was simply not done. Not in this town, not in this decade. Eleanor's mother passed through twice with no particular errand, the way mothers did, checking without checking. This went on for months, Sunday calls, the occasional supervised outing to the picture show downtown, always in a small group, never alone, at least not at first. A walk after church, in view of whoever else happened to be walking that same stretch of sidewalk. By the autumn, things had progressed to what the town would have recognised as going steady, a phrase that carried real social weight in 1952, more weight than it carries now, when the same words mean something far looser. Going steady meant something had been decided, even if the decision had never been spoken aloud in those terms. It meant Eleanor stopped being asked to dances by other young men, because everyone understood, by some shared and unspoken consensus, that she was no longer available in that way. It meant Walter's mother began, very gently, very carefully, to include Eleanor in small family gatherings, a Sunday dinner here, a birthday there, evaluations disguised as hospitality. Eleanor remembers sitting at that table the first time, painfully aware that everything she did, how she held her fork, how she spoke to Walter's younger sister, whether she offered to help clear the dishes without being asked, was being quietly recorded and weighed. The proposal, when it came in February, was not really a surprise, not in the way proposals are sometimes imagined to be. There had been a conversation weeks earlier between Walter and Eleanor's father, a conversation Eleanor was not present for and only heard about second-hand in fragments, the way these things tended to filter down to the women in a family, even when the women were the ones whose lives were actually being decided. Walter had asked her father's permission. This was still very much the expected order of operations in a town like this one, even as the practice was beginning, in larger cities, to feel a little old-fashioned to some. Her father had said yes, apparently without much hesitation, which Eleanor had taken, at the time, as confirmation that she was making a sound and sensible choice, the kind of choice a good daughter makes. The actual proposal happened on a Friday evening, on the porch swing, after a dinner at her parents' house that had felt, in retrospect, oddly formal for an ordinary Friday. Walter had been nervous in a way she'd not seen before, fumbling slightly with his words, and had produced a small ring, modest by any standard, a thin gold band with a diamond so small it would later prompt a few quietly unkind comments from a cousin who had married into more money. Eleanor remembers saying yes before he had quite finished the sentence, partly out of genuine affection, and partly, if she is honest with herself in the dark this morning, out of relief, the relief of a question finally being settled, of a particular kind of social waiting finally coming to an end. What followed the engagement was its own elaborate set of customs, almost a second courtship, this one conducted in public, in full view of the town. The engagement was announced in the local paper, a small item in the social column, the kind of notice that ran alongside news of church suppers and 4-H club meetings, listing the names of both sets of parents, Eleanor's education, which amounted to 2 years at the local teachers' college before she had left to take the job at the library, and Walter's position at the plant. There was an engagement party, hosted by Eleanor's mother, where female relatives and friends brought small gifts, and the assembled company performed a particular kind of joyful scrutiny that Eleanor had grown up watching happen to other young women, and had never quite imagined would happen to her in turn. The etiquette books of the period devoted entire chapters to the engagement period, and reading them now feels almost like reading instructions for a play in which every actor has memorized lines they never consciously chose to learn. A bride-to-be was counselled on how to behave when congratulated, gracious, never boastful, deflecting praise toward her fiancé's good qualities rather than her own good fortune. She was counseled on the proper etiquette of returning an engagement ring should the engagement be broken, a small, cold detail that hints at how seriously these arrangements were taken, how much of a contract this all actually was beneath the romance of it. She was counseled on thank you notes, on which relatives to invite, on the delicate matter of seating an estranged aunt at a respectful distance from an equally estranged uncle, and running underneath all of it, in nearly every advice column and every manual Eleanor's mother had quietly placed on her nightstand over the preceding months, was a steady undercurrent of instruction about what kind of wife she was expected to become, not just a bride for one day, but a wife for the rest of her life, and the wedding itself was understood by everyone as the formal beginning of an education that had actually started years earlier, in childhood, watching her own mother manage a household, and would now intensify now that the theoretical had become imminent. I want to slow down here for a moment because this part matters, and it is easy to rush past it the way a textbook might. The good wife literature of post-war America was not a fringe phenomenon. It was mainstream, ordinary, sitting on shelves in respectable homes next to cookbooks and hymnals. Magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's ran columns with titles that, read today, have a strange double quality. They can sound almost satirical, and yet they were written with complete sincerity by women, often addressed to other women, as genuine guidance rather than as commentary. A wife was advised to have dinner ready when her husband returned from work, to freshen her appearance before he walked through the door, to keep the children quiet and the household calm so that his evening after a long day at the plant or the office could be a kind of refuge. She was advised not to greet him with complaints about her own day, however difficult it had been, because his burdens were understood to be the heavier ones, the ones that mattered more to the household's survival. There is a particular pamphlet, I am not inventing this, it genuinely circulated in various forms across the country in this period, that listed with the calm confidence of a recipe card the steps a good wife should take to prepare for her husband's homecoming each evening. Have a delicious meal ready, prepare yourself, touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair, be a little gay and a little more interesting for him. His boring day may need a lift, minimize the noise. At the time of his arrival, eliminate all noise of the washer, dryer, dishwasher, or vacuum. Greet him with a warm smile and be glad to see him. Listen to him. You may have a dozen things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Make the evening his. Never complain if he does not take you out to dinner or to other entertainment. Try to understand his world of strain and pressure and his need to be home and relax. Eleanor has not seen this exact pamphlet, but she has absorbed something close enough to its spirit from a dozen different sources over the last several years. The way you absorb the temperature of a room without anyone explicitly telling you it is cold. This is the part of the story that gets left out of the photograph albums entirely. Not because anyone was hiding it particularly, but because it was so completely ordinary, so woven into the fabric of expectation, that it did not occur to anyone to record it. Nobody photographs the unspoken curriculum a young woman absorbs in the 18 months between a first dance and a wedding ceremony. There is no album page for the dozens of small lessons, some explicit, most not, about deference, about cheerfulness, about making yourself smaller and quieter and more agreeable so that a household runs smoothly. Eleanor's own mother gave her some of this instruction directly, in the kitchen, over the washing up, in the kind of conversation that happens sideways, while both women's hands are busy with something else, because it is easier to say difficult things when you are not looking directly at each other. I think about that kitchen conversation often, when I think about this period, not because it was cruel. It was not cruel, not even close. It was offered with real love, real worry, real wanting the best for her daughter, but because of what it reveals about the limits of what could be said even between a mother and a daughter on the edge of such an enormous change. Eleanor's mother talked about patience, about picking her battles, about the particular quiet diplomacy required to live inside another family's habits and expectations, because that is, in a very real sense, what marriage in this period asked of a woman. Not simply a new last name, but an entire transplantation into someone else's world, his routines, his mother's recipes, his town if it happened to be different from her own, his way of taking his coffee and his particular silences and his particular moods on a Monday. What Eleanor's mother did not talk about, what almost no mother of this generation talked about with any real clarity, was the wedding night itself. This is one of those details that, once you really sit with it, tells you something enormously important about the era, more important in some ways than the dress or the cake or the vows. An entire culture had built up around courtship and engagement and marriage with extraordinary specificity. What fork to use, what to write in a thank you note, how to address an invitation, how to seat a difficult relative. And yet, on the single most intimate and frightening unknown a young bride faced, the silence was almost total. Mothers in this era were genuinely caught in a difficult position, and I do not think it is fair to judge them too harshly for the silence, even though the silence caused real harm. They themselves had often received almost no guidance from their own mothers a generation earlier. Sex in the open, plain language we might use for it now, was simply not discussed between generations of women in most American households of this period, not even obliquely, not even in euphemism, beyond the barest, vaguest gestures toward what a wife owed a husband, or what to expect, delivered usually in a single uncomfortable conversation, often the night before the wedding, sometimes not even then. Some brides received nothing at all beyond a small sealed pamphlet purchased quietly by a mother or an aunt, written in the clinical, slightly evasive language of the era, more concerned with hygiene and modesty than with anything resembling honest preparation. Eleanor's mother, to her credit, did say something 2 nights ago, sitting on the edge of Eleanor's bed after the lights were out, in a voice pitched low enough that it would not carry to the room where Eleanor's younger sister was sleeping. It was brief. It was vague in the specific ways and oddly direct in others. There was talk of being patient with Walter, of trusting that he would be gentle, of the whole matter becoming easier with time, the way most things did. Eleanor remembers nodding in the dark, grateful for the gesture even as she understood, with a kind of resigned clarity, that she still did not actually know very much at all about what was coming, only that she was expected to face it with the same composed grace she was expected to bring to everything else this week. This is the detail that stops me every time I sit with this story. An entire community could organize itself with extraordinary precision around the symbolism of a veil, the placement of a boutonniere, the correct wording of a wedding invitation, down to the precise abbreviation of R.S.V.P. and yet leave a young woman almost entirely alone, in the dark, on the most significant night of profound physical and emotional unknown she had yet faced in her adult life. The contrast says something true about what this culture actually valued and what it quietly, persistently chose not to talk about. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and the night is still hours away. Right now, in the grey, not quite light of 5 in the morning, Eleanor is finally getting up. The floor is cold under her bare feet, the particular cold of June mornings in a midwestern frame house, where the night air settles into the boards and lingers until the sun has had a few real hours to work on it. She pads down the hallway to the bathroom, careful with the third step, the one that creaks, an old habit from years of sneaking past her parents' door as a teenager, though there is no real need for quiet this morning. Her mother is already awake. Eleanor can hear her downstairs, the particular rhythm of her movement in the kitchen, a drawer opening, the soft clatter of the percolator being filled at the sink, sounds so familiar that they barely register as sound at all, more like the low hum a house makes when it is alive and occupied. In the bathroom mirror, under a bulb that has always run a little yellow, she studies her own face for a moment longer than she usually would, There are faint shadows under her eyes that no amount of the new cream her mother bought her last week is likely to fully hide. She runs the cold water and lets it pool in her cupped hands and presses her face into it, and for just a second in the shock of the cold, there is a kind of clarity, the sort that arrives uninvited at strange hours. She thinks briefly, with no real warning, about the library, about the particular hush of the reading room in late afternoon, the smell of paper and the old radiator, the quiet, ordinary satisfaction of reshelving returned books in their correct places, a job she will not be returning to after today, because married women in this town, particularly married women whose husbands held steady jobs, were not generally expected to keep working, not unless the family genuinely needed the income, and the unspoken understanding in Eleanor's family was that they did not. She has not fully grieved this yet, the ending of that small particular life. There has not really been room for grief in the last several months, crowded as they have been with fittings and invitations and the dozen small decisions a wedding apparently requires of a young woman who, 6 months ago, could not have told you the difference between ecru and ivory, 2 shades of off-white that the woman at the dress shop had discussed with the gravity of a doctor discussing a diagnosis. Eleanor dries her face on the towel that still smells faintly of her mother's preferred soap and goes back down the hall to dress for breakfast. Because there is, of course, breakfast first, and her mother will not allow the day to begin properly until everyone has eaten something, bride included, regardless of how little appetite the bride in question currently has. Downstairs, the kitchen is warm in a way the rest of the house is not yet, heated by the stove and by her mother's constant motion around it. Eleanor's mother, let us call her Ruth, a sturdy, practical name for a sturdy, practical woman, is wearing her housecoat still, hair pinned up under a scarf, moving between the stove and the counter with the economy of someone who has made 10,000 breakfasts in this exact kitchen, and could do it with her eyes closed if it ever came to that. There is coffee already going, and Ruth has made Eleanor's favourite, soft scrambled eggs and toast with the crusts left on, because Eleanor, despite being 22 years old and about to be married, still occasionally picks the crusts off if given the choice, an old childhood habit neither of them has ever bothered to correct. "Sit," Ruth says, without turning around, the single word carrying the particular weight of every morning of Eleanor's life. And Eleanor sits at the same chair at the same small table she has sat at since she was old enough to hold a fork herself. There is something almost unbearably tender about this, though Eleanor does not have language for it yet this morning, too tired and too full of static to examine her own feelings with any precision. This is the last ordinary breakfast in this house as her parents' unmarried daughter. After today she will eat breakfast in a different kitchen, a kitchen she has visited only a handful of times, with a different set of dishes and a different rhythm to the morning. And Ruth seems to understand this too, moving with a kind of careful tenderness this morning that is not quite her usual brisk efficiency, lingering an extra moment as she sets the plate down, her hand resting briefly, lightly, on Eleanor's shoulder before she turns back to the stove. They do not talk much over breakfast. There is a list written in Ruth's careful hand on a scrap of paper propped against the sugar bowl, the kind of list that has been added to and crossed off and added to again over the past several days, and Ruth consults it now between bites of her own toast, murmuring half to herself, half to Eleanor about what time the hairdresser is expected, what time Eleanor's aunt and uncle are due to arrive from 2 towns over, what time the photographer wants everyone assembled at the church for the pictures that will, by tradition, be taken before the ceremony rather than after, so that nothing delays the reception once the vows are finished. It strikes Eleanor, sitting there with her eggs going slightly cold, how much of this entire day has been planned, scheduled, accounted for, down to the quarter hour by other people, her mother, the minister's wife, who has coordinated countless weddings at this church and runs them with the quiet authority of a stage manager, the florist, the photographer, the woman at the dress shop, even Walter's mother, who has had strong, gently stated opinions about the seating arrangement at the reception. Eleanor has been consulted, certainly, asked her preferences on the flowers and the music and the particular shade of the bridesmaids' dresses, 3 shades of pale blue laid out on swatches across the kitchen table one evening back in March. But the day itself, the actual architecture of these next 12 hours, belongs in a real sense to everyone but her. She is the center of it and somehow also the least consulted party in the room, the person around whom the entire elaborate machine has been built and who is now expected simply to walk through the day as it has been designed, performing at every step an emotion, joy, gratitude, radiant happiness that she is meant to feel rather than choose. I do not want to overstate this. There is real affection in every part of this morning, real love behind the careful list on Ruth's scrap of paper, real warmth in the hand that rested on Eleanor's shoulder a few minutes ago. This is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about something quieter and, in its own way, harder to see clearly, which is the difference between a day built with love and a day built with the bride's actual interior experience genuinely at its center. Those two things can overlap significantly and still not be quite the same. And Eleanor, 22 years old, sitting at her childhood kitchen table on the morning of her wedding, is beginning to understand the difference even if she does not yet have the words for it. By 8 o'clock the house has begun to fill with a particular kind of organized chaos. The hairdresser arrives first, a heavy-set, cheerful woman named Mrs. Hollis who does hair for most of the brides in this end of the county and has by now a kind of professional fluency with bridal nerves, talking easily and constantly while she works about nothing in particular, the weather, a recipe, her own daughter's troubles with a new puppy, filling the silence so that Eleanor does not have to. There is something almost kind in this, Eleanor thinks, sitting still while Mrs. Hollis pins and curls and sprays, a kindness in the relentless, undemanding chatter, a kindness that asks nothing of Eleanor except that she sit there and occasionally make a small sound of agreement. Eleanor's hair, set the night before in the small, tight pin curls she slept on so awkwardly that she barely slept at all, is brushed out now into soft waves, swept up and back from her face in the style the magazines have been showing all spring, with a few careful pieces left loose at her temples to soften the line. Mrs. Hollis works with bobby pins held between her lips, the way hairdressers of this generation always seem to, and Eleanor watches herself slowly transform in the mirror propped against the dresser, watches a face she recognizes become, gradually, a face built for an occasion, polished and arranged into something more formal than the face she woke up with. Her younger sister Carol, 14 and thrilled to be allowed to watch the entire proceeding, sits cross-legged on the bed behind her, peppering her with questions Eleanor only half answers. Is she nervous? Is Walter nervous? Does it feel different, being about to be married? Does she feel like a different person already? Eleanor answers as best she can, giving Carol the version of the truth that a 14-year-old can comfortably hold, the version where nerves are simply excitement wearing a slightly different coat, where the whole enormous unspoken weight of the day is folded down small enough to fit inside a sentence like, "I suppose I am a little nervous, but mostly excited." It is not a lie exactly, it is simply incomplete. The way most things said out loud on a day like this one tend to be incomplete. The dress comes next. It has been hanging in its tissue paper for 3 days, ever since the final fitting at Mrs. Pemberton's shop downtown, and when Ruth carefully unwraps it now and lays it across the bed, Carol actually gasps, a small genuine sound that makes Eleanor smile despite everything churning underneath her composure. It is a beautiful dress. There is no arguing with that. Ivory satin, not the stark white some of the bridal magazines favor this season, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that falls to the floor in soft structured folds, and a modest neckline trimmed with a narrow band of lace that Mrs. Pemberton sourced specially, lace that Eleanor's mother had admired so openly during the first fitting that the shop owner had quietly thrown in a discount on it. A small kindness between women who understood what this day cost a family, in every sense of the word cost. Getting into the dress is its own small production, requiring 3 sets of hands, Ruth fastens the long row of tiny satin-covered buttons up the back, each one taking a moment to work through its loop, while Mrs. Hollis adjusts the slip underneath to make sure the skirt falls correctly, and Carol hovers nearby, holding pins, fetching things, generally underfoot in the eager, useful way of a younger sibling who has been waiting all year for a job to do. Eleanor stands still through all of it, arms slightly raised, breathing carefully because the bodice, fitted precisely to her measurements 3 weeks ago, allows for almost no slack now, a tightness she will simply have to manage for the next several hours, the way a corset or a girdle manages a body into a particular silhouette, regardless of whether that body would prefer to breathe more easily. I want to pause here and say something about the dress itself, about what it represented in this particular cultural moment, because it is easy, looking at old photographs now, to see only the prettiness of it, the satin and lace, and miss the considerable weight of expectation stitched into every seam. The wedding dress in 1953 America was governed by an etiquette nearly as rigid as the dress itself. White, or the softer ivory variations like Eleanor's, remained the overwhelming standard for a first marriage, carrying with it, whether explicitly acknowledged or not, an old and uncomfortable symbolism around purity that every bride in this era understood, on some level, was being silently evaluated. A widow remarrying, or a woman marrying for a second time under less fortunate circumstances, was expected to choose a different color, something pale blue or dusty rose, a quiet social signal that everyone in attendance would read correctly without a word needing to be said. The length of the train, the style of the veil, even the particular cut of the neckline, all carried small, specific meanings that the women of the congregation, watching from their pews later this morning, would register and discuss, kindly or otherwise, over coffee in the days that followed. The veil itself deserves its own attention, because it is in many ways the single most loaded object in the entire ceremony, more freighted with old meaning than the dress, more freighted even than the ring. Eleanor's veil, also from Mrs. Pemberton's shop, is a fingertip length of fine illusion netting attached to a small pearl-studded headpiece, the kind worn pulled forward over the face for the walk down the aisle and lifted back in a small choreographed motion at a specific point in the ceremony. That lifting of the veil, performed traditionally by the bride's father, who delivers her down the aisle and then, in the old form of the ritual, lifts the veil before placing her hand in the groom's, carries inside it an entire history that most people in the church this morning will not be consciously thinking about, but that lingers nonetheless in the symbolism of the gesture. The veiled bride walking blind, in a sense, toward a man she is trusting to receive her, her face hidden until the moment of formal transfer from one family's authority to another's. It is an old image, older than this church, older than this country, and it survives in 1953 largely as aesthetic tradition, stripped of most people's conscious awareness of its original weight. And yet something of that old weight remains anyway, the way old houses retain a particular quality of cold in certain rooms no matter how many times they are renovated. Eleanor has not thought much about any of this, not in these terms, not until just now, standing in front of the mirror in her childhood bedroom with the veil pinned carefully into her freshly set hair, looking at a reflection that does not entirely look like her anymore. There is something strange about it, watching yourself become an image, a symbol, a bride, rather than simply a young woman named Eleanor who likes reshelving library books and used to pick the crusts off her toast. The mirror shows her something composed and lovely and almost ceremonial, and underneath the satin and the lace and the careful waves of her hair, she still feels exactly the same as she did at 4:50 this morning, lying awake in the dark, doing arithmetic nobody asked her to do. By 9:30, the house is properly full. Eleanor's aunt and uncle arrive from 2 towns over. her uncle's car pulling into the gravel drive with a crunch that Carol announces from the front window like a town crier. Behind them comes a cousin Eleanor has not seen since Christmas, and behind the cousin, two of Eleanor's closest friends, Dorothy and Marjorie, who will stand up with her today as bridesmaids, both already dressed in the pale blue gowns Eleanor chose back in March, both arriving with the particular nervous energy of young women who understand on some level that they are watching a preview of their own futures. The house, for the next hour, becomes a kind of staging ground, women moving through it with purposeful urgency, the air thick with hairspray, and the particular mingled scent of several different perfumes, none of which quite agree with each other in such close quarters. Eleanor sits at her dressing table while Dorothy helps with her stockings, rolling them carefully up over her knees and fastening them to the garter belt beneath the slip, while Marjorie searches the jewellery box for the small pearl earrings Eleanor's grandmother wore at her own wedding, the ones that have already done service for 3 other brides in the family, and are considered by now something close to a good luck charm. It is Dorothy who notices first. She is kneeling at Eleanor's feet, adjusting the seam of a stocking, when she looks up and catches something in Eleanor's face that the rest of the room, busy with its own small tasks, has not yet registered. Eleanor's eyes have gone glassy, that particular shine that precedes tears, and her hands, folded in her lap, have gone very still in a way that does not match the cheerful, mild expression she has been carefully maintaining all morning. Dorothy says nothing at first. She simply reaches up and takes Eleanor's hand, gives it one firm squeeze and says, quietly, just between the two of them, "You don't have to be anything right now, just breathe a second." This is the part of the story that almost never survives in any photograph, and yet it is in its own way one of the truest things about how women supported each other through this particular kind of day in 1953. There was an entire unspoken system of cover performed by mothers and sisters and friends and bridesmaids, all working in quiet, practiced concert to absorb a bride's private fear or grief or simple exhaustion before it could reach the surface where guests might see it. Marjorie, sensing something has shifted in the room, moves to block the doorway with her body, a casual lean against the frame that nonetheless ensures nobody else wanders in for the next few minutes. Ruth, catching the change in the air from across the room, finds a sudden, urgent need to check on something downstairs, taking Carol with her, clearing the room without ever announcing that she is doing so. For perhaps 90 seconds, Eleanor allows herself to cry, carefully, with the particular restraint of someone who knows her makeup cannot afford real disruption, 2 or 3 tears escaping before Dorothy is already there with a folded handkerchief, dabbing gently at the corner of Eleanor's eye with the precision of someone who has clearly done this before, for other brides in other bedrooms in other Junes. "There," Dorothy says when it is done, "nobody will ever know." And there is something almost ferocious in the gentleness of it, a kind of fierce, practical love between women that asks no questions about why Eleanor needed those 90 seconds, offers no analysis, simply provides the cover required and moves on. I find this detail extraordinarily moving every time I sit with it. It would have been so easy for this story to disappear entirely, the way most unrecorded private moments between women in this era simply vanished, leaving behind only the smiling photographs taken an hour later. But I think it is worth saying clearly, beneath the rigid performed cheerfulness that 1953 demanded of its brides, there existed a parallel, almost entirely undocumented economy of female solidarity. Women catching each other, covering for each other, absorbing each other's fear so that the performance the world expected could continue uninterrupted. Nobody wrote etiquette columns about this, nobody photographed it. And yet it happened, in bedroom after bedroom, in town after town, all across the country, on wedding mornings exactly like this one. By the time the room fills back up, Ruth returning with a fresh pot of coffee for the assembled women, Carol trailing behind with a plate of the cookies that have been sitting untouched on the dining room sideboard since yesterday. Eleanor's face shows nothing. She is smiling again, the careful, composed smile she has been practicing in mirrors for weeks now, accepting a cup of coffee she does not particularly want, laughing at something her cousin says about the heat. Fully restored to the surface everyone expects of her. Only Dorothy, catching her eye for a brief second across the crowded room, knows what just happened, and the knowledge passes between them silently, a small private understanding that will never be spoken of again, not even years later, not even when the two of them are old women themselves, comparing notes on the strange machinery of the lives they built. Eleanor's father comes up around 11, dressed already in his good dark suit, the one he wears to funerals and weddings and very little else, looking faintly uncomfortable in the stiff collar the way he always does on formal occasions. He is not a man given to long speeches, Eleanor's father, a quiet man who has spent 30 years selling hardware and farm tools to the same families over and over, who expresses most of his affection through small practical gestures rather than words. He stands in the doorway of her room for a moment, taking in the dress, the veil, the whole transformed picture of his daughter, and something moves visibly across his face, something he does not quite have language for either, and for a moment father and daughter simply look at each other across the small bedroom. 22 years of history compressed into a silence neither of them tries to fill. "You look like your mother did," he says finally, which is, from him, an enormous statement, the closest he is likely to come today to saying anything about how he is feeling. And Eleanor understands this, accepts it for the gift it is, crosses the room and kisses his cheek carefully so as not to disturb either of their composure. He clears his throat, glances at his watch, announces that the cars will be ready in 20 minutes, and retreats back downstairs, leaving Eleanor alone for just a moment with the strange, heavy knowledge that this is among the last times she will be only her father's daughter, before she becomes, in the eyes of the law and the church and the entire watching town, primarily someone else's wife. The drive to the church takes 11 minutes. Eleanor knows this because she has made the trip 1,000 times in her life, to Sunday services and Christmas pageants and, more recently, to the rehearsal 2 evenings ago. Today it feels longer and shorter at once. The strange elastic quality time takes on during moments that matter enormously. She rides with her father, just the two of them in the front seat of his Ford, her veil lifted back for now to keep it from crushing against the seat, her gloved hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar streets of her town slide past the window, the hardware store where her father has worked her whole life, the library where she will not be returning to work on Monday, the drugstore where she and Walter shared their first proper date, a chocolate soda split 2 ways with 2 straws, an image so ordinary and sweet that it makes her chest tighten now, remembering it. Her father does not say much during the drive either, beyond a comment about the weather holding fair, a small mercy given how much rain the region has seen this spring. But as they pull into the gravel lot beside the church and he shifts the car into park, he reaches over, before either of them moves to get out, and pats her gloved hand twice. A small, wordless gesture that somehow contains more than any speech could have managed. "All right then," he says, which seems to mean several things at once, that he loves her, that he is proud of her, that he hopes this is the right thing, that there is nothing more to be done now except to walk her through these doors and hand her over, formally, to a life he cannot follow her into. The church itself, when they step inside through the side entrance reserved for the wedding party, is humming with a particular kind of organized activity that Eleanor recognizes from every wedding she has ever attended as a guest, though it feels entirely different now from the inside of it. The photographer, a thin, nervous young man named Mr. Schaefer, who runs the only photography studio in town, is already arranging the wedding party for the formal portraits that tradition dictates be taken before the ceremony rather than after, so that the reception, once the vows are spoken, can proceed without further delay. This is, in fact, one of the more practical aspects of 1950s wedding choreography, the idea that a couple should not be kept from their own reception by an hour of standing for photographs immediately after the most emotionally significant moment of the day, so the photographs happen first, in something closer to a rehearsal mood, before the actual ceremony has occurred. Eleanor stands for picture after picture, with her parents, with her bridesmaids, with Carol beaming proudly at her side, the veil lifted back from her face for these formal shots, her expression arranged into the soft, composed smile she has been practicing. Mr. Schaefer directs everyone with the slightly anxious precision of a man who knows these photographs will be studied closely for years, hung on walls, passed down to children and grandchildren, and he wants very much to get the lighting right in the dim church interior, fussing with his equipment, asking everyone to hold still just a moment longer, just one more. It is during this stretch of waiting, standing for photographs in a dress that does not allow for deep breathing, that Eleanor catches her first glimpse of Walter across the vestibule, where he stands with his own small cluster of groomsmen, equally stiff in his rented formal wear, equally subjected to Mr. Schaefer's careful arrangements. He catches her eye for just a moment, across the crowded, busy space, and something in his face, a kind of nervous, hopeful uncertainty that mirrors almost exactly what she has been carrying all morning, softens something in her chest unexpectedly. He is nervous too, she realizes, watching him. Whatever this day is, whatever enormous, frightening, unknowable thing it represents, he is walking into it just as blind as she is, just as unprepared by the silences of his own upbringing, just as alone in his own particular way despite the crowd of groomsmen around him. This small recognition does not solve anything, does not undo the long night of arithmetic she did in the dark this morning, does not answer the question of whether what she feels for him is the love the novels promised her, or something quieter and more practical that will have to grow into love over years, the way her own parents' marriage seems to have done. But it offers something, a small thread of shared humanity across the crowded vestibule, the simple, steadying knowledge that she is not the only frightened person in this building today. The photographs finish a little before noon, and there is a brief lull then, a strange suspended interval while the guests finish filing into the pews and the wedding party assembles in the small vestibule at the back of the church, waiting for the organist to finish the prelude pieces and begin the processional proper. Eleanor stands at the very back, her father beside her, her veil now lowered carefully back down over her face by Ruth's practiced hands, the netting softening the world in front of her into something slightly blurred, slightly dreamlike, exactly as it is meant to. Through the half-open door at the end of the vestibule, she can hear the murmur of the gathered congregation, perhaps 120 people, family and friends, and a fair portion of the church's regular membership, who would attend any wedding held here regardless of how well they knew the couple, because attending weddings was simply part of the social fabric of a small town in this period, an obligation and a pleasure intertwined. She can hear, faintly, individual voices rising above the general murmur, someone's child fussing 2 rows back, an older woman's voice carrying a comment about the flowers, the particular creak of the old pews as people shift and settle, the architecture of the ceremony itself, the precise order of events that is about to unfold, was governed by an etiquette nearly as detailed and codified as everything else about this day. The processional order was fixed by tradition and discussed at some length during the rehearsal 2 evenings ago, the groomsmen entering first from a side door near the altar, followed by the bridesmaids walking singly down the center aisle at a measured, deliberate pace, followed by the maid of honor, followed finally by the bride herself, on her father's arm, the last and most significant entrance, timed precisely so that the congregation's collective attention, having been gradually built through each preceding entrance, would land with its full weight on Eleanor the moment the doors opened. The organist begins the wedding march, and the doors at the back of the church swing open, and the entire congregation rises as one body, a sound like a single collective breath, the rustle of 120 people standing simultaneously, turning to look. Eleanor feels her father's arm tense slightly under her gloved hand, feels her own pulse jump at the sudden wash of attention, every face in the church turned toward her, every eye assessing the dress, the veil, the bride herself, in the particular, comprehensive way a small town assesses anything significant that happens within it. This is, I think, one of the most psychologically demanding moments built into the entire architecture of the day, and it is rarely discussed in those terms. The bridal walk down the aisle asks a young woman to process in real time, under total public scrutiny, an enormous accumulation of private feeling, fear, hope, grief, love, uncertainty, all of it churning together while maintaining a serene, composed exterior for the benefit of 120 watching strangers and semi-strangers and beloved relatives all at once. There is no private version of this walk. Every step is observed, every flicker of expression noted and discussed later, over coffee, in the days that follow. Eleanor has watched other brides make this same walk, has sat in these same pews assessing other young women's composure, and only now, walking it herself, does she understand fully what it actually costs to maintain that practiced, serene expression while your whole chest is a fist of feeling. Her father's arm is steady beneath her hand, and she focuses on that steadiness, on the particular cadence of their pace, slow, measured, in time with the music, neither too quick nor too slow, exactly as rehearsed. She does not look at the individual faces turned toward her, not really, her eyes fixed instead somewhere just past the altar, on the middle distance, the way Mrs. Hollis advised her this morning, a small trick of focus that helps steady a bride's nerve during the long walk. And then, gradually, the middle distance resolves into Walter, standing at the front beside the minister, watching her approach with an expression she will remember for the rest of her life, something unguarded and genuinely moved, the practiced nervousness of the morning's photographs entirely replaced now by something that looks, unmistakably, like real feeling. It is this, more than anything else in the entire elaborate machinery of the day, that catches Eleanor off guard. She had expected to feel the weight of the watching congregation. She had expected the particular vertigo of being the center of so much collective attention. What she had not fully expected was the way Walter's face, seeing her walk toward him in this dress, in this veil, would land somewhere underneath all of that performed composure and touch something real. Whatever this marriage is going to be, whatever shape it eventually settles into over the coming years, she understands, walking the last several steps of the aisle, that this man is genuinely glad to be marrying her, glad in a way that has nothing to do with social arrangement or family approval or the practical merits of a steady job at the plant. It is a small thing, perhaps, set against the enormity of everything else this day represents, but it is real, and Eleanor will carry the memory of his face in that moment for the rest of her life, long after she has forgotten the precise words of the vows she is about to speak. Her father releases her hand at the front of the church, performs the brief formal ritual of the moment, the minister asking who gives this woman to be married, her father answering in the traditional formula that her mother and he do, and then, in the gesture Eleanor has been quietly thinking about all morning, lifts her veil back from her face, the netting settling softly behind her head, exposing her expression fully now to Walter, to the minister, to the entire watching congregation. There is no privacy left in this moment, nowhere for any private feeling to hide, and Eleanor understands, standing there with her face fully revealed, that this is precisely the point of the gesture, an old, almost ceremonial transfer from one kind of protection to another, her father's hand placing hers into Walter's, the formal symbolic handover the entire morning has been building toward. The ceremony itself, once it begins in earnest, moves at the unhurried pace of liturgical tradition, the minister's voice filling the church with the familiar cadences Eleanor has heard at every wedding she has ever attended, the same words, more or less, that have been spoken in this exact building for generations. There is something steadying in the familiarity of it, in the way the ritual language asks nothing improvised of either bride or groom, simply the recitation of vows that countless couples before them have spoken, in this same sanctuary, under this same stained glass. the morning light filtering through the coloured panels and falling in soft fractured patches across the stone floor. The vows themselves in this Protestant ceremony in this particular small Ohio town follow the traditional form almost word for word: to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do them part. Eleanor speaks her portion in a voice steadier than she expected, the words coming out clear and audible despite the tightness in her chest, and she is aware, even as she speaks them, of a strange doubling in her own mind, a part of her fully present in the moment, meaning every word as sincerely as she knows how, and another part of her observing the whole scene almost from a slight distance, aware of how this moment will be remembered, retold, photographed, aware that she is performing something as much as she is experiencing it, the two things tangled together in a way she suspects she will spend years trying to untangle. Walter's voice, when his turn comes, wavers very slightly on the word cherish, a small crack in his composure that nobody but Eleanor, standing close enough to see it, likely notices, and something in her softens further at this small evidence of his own private nervousness breaking through. The ring, when it is produced by the best man, slides onto her finger with a small ceremonial pause. The minister's words about the unbroken circle of the ring representing the unbroken circle of their union washing over the congregation in the particular, slightly worn cadence of words spoken at every wedding this minister has performed for the past 2 decades. And then, finally, the pronouncement, man and wife, and the kiss, brief, formal, public, performed under the full weight of 120 pairs of watching eyes, and the organ swelling into the recessional, and Eleanor and Walter turning together to walk back up the aisle as husband and wife for the first time, her hand now resting in the crook of his arm rather than her father's, the entire congregation rising again, smiling, some of the older women already dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs, the whole church suddenly loud with the particular joyful noise of a wedding successfully completed. I want to note something here, something that gets lost when we only see this moment in photographs. The walk back up the aisle as husband and wife happens considerably faster than the walk down it did, the pace noticeably quickened, almost giddy, a kind of collective release of tension after the held breath of the ceremony itself. Eleanor finds herself almost laughing, an unexpected bubble of genuine surprised happiness rising up through everything else she has been carrying all morning. Walter's arm steady under her hand, the faces blurring past on either side now, no longer individually assessed and weighed the way they were on the walk-in. Simply a warm, blurred wash of goodwill and relief and celebration. It would be easy, watching only this moment, to believe that everything difficult about the morning has resolved itself, that the arithmetic Eleanor did in the dark at 4:50 has simply dissolved in the warmth of the ceremony's completion. That is not quite true, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. The questions she carried into this church do not vanish simply because the vows have been spoken. But something has shifted nonetheless, something real, and as she and Walter step out through the heavy church doors into the bright June daylight, into a small crowd of well-wishers already gathering with handfuls of rice to throw, Eleanor allows herself, for just a moment, to feel something close to genuine joy, uncomplicated by all the rest of it, simply the physical, immediate pleasure of sunlight and noise and her hand in Walter's, the two of them laughing together at the rice stinging lightly against their faces and necks, newly married, the hardest part of the public performance for the moment behind them. The receiving line forms almost immediately just outside the church doors, under the shade of the old elm trees that line the front walk, and this too follows a precise and well-understood choreography that 1953 would have recognized instantly. Eleanor and Walter stand together, flanked by their respective parents, in the order etiquette prescribed, the bride's mother first, then the groom's parents, then the bride and groom themselves, then, depending on the formality of the occasion, the maid of honor and best man at the end of the line. Every guest who attended the ceremony is now expected to pass through this line individually, offering a brief word of congratulation, perhaps a quick embrace or a handshake, before moving on toward whatever reception venue awaits. In this case, the church's own fellowship hall, set up since early morning with long tables and white clothes for the wedding breakfast to follow. The receiving line is, in its own quiet way, almost as demanding as the ceremony itself, though it receives far less attention in most accounts of this era's weddings. For perhaps 40 minutes, Eleanor stands in the June heat, her dress growing warmer by the minute, greeting a continuous stream of relatives and family friends and neighbors and members of the congregation she has known her whole life, offering each one a fresh, genuine-seeming smile, a few appropriate words, the particular performance of delighted gratitude that a receiving line demands no matter how many times it must be repeated. Her cheeks ache faintly by the 20th or 30th guest, the muscles unused to sustaining a single expression for this long, but she does not let it show, has been taught implicitly over years of watching other brides do exactly this, that the receiving line is not a place where fatigue is permitted to surface. There is an elderly aunt, Walter's great-aunt actually, who holds Eleanor's hand a beat too long, peering at her with the frank, slightly unsettling appraisal of someone who has attended dozens of family weddings over the decades and feels entitled to comment freely. "You'll do," the woman says, finally, with the air of someone delivering a verdict rather than a congratulation, and moves on down the line before Eleanor can quite decide how to respond, leaving her with a small, strange sting that she does not have time to examine before the next well-wisher arrives. This sort of comment, delivered casually, almost in passing, was not unusual in this era, and it points to something important about what a wedding day actually represented for the community gathered to witness it. A wedding in a town like this one was not solely or even primarily a private celebration of two individuals' feelings for each other. It was a public event of social significance, an occasion on which an entire community gathered to evaluate, formally, whether a particular match met its standards. Was the bride suitable? Was the groom steady? Did the families involved carry the right kind of reputation? Was this, in the broadest sense, a good match for the town as a whole, not merely for the two people standing at the center of it? Eleanor, smiling through the receiving line, is being assessed continuously by every person who passes through it, even as she is being congratulated, the two things happening simultaneously, inseparably, the way they always had at weddings of this kind. By the time the receiving line finally thins and the wedding party can make their way into the fellowship hall, Eleanor's feet ache inside the new shoes that have not yet been properly broken in, and the bodice of her dress, which felt merely snug this morning, now feels genuinely restrictive after nearly 2 hours of standing, smiling, embracing, holding her shoulders just so. Nobody, of course, would think to ask if she needed to sit down, needed water, needed even 5 private minutes to simply breathe without an audience. The day's momentum carries forward regardless, the wedding breakfast already laid out and waiting, the guests already filtering toward their assigned tables, the photographer hovering again at the edges, ready to capture the next portion of the day's required images. The wedding breakfast itself, called a breakfast by tradition even though it is in this case served closer to one in the afternoon, a small linguistic relic from an earlier era when wedding ceremonies more commonly took place first thing in the morning, is a substantial affair laid out across the long tables of the fellowship hall, prepared largely by the women of the church's ladies' auxiliary who have been at work in the church kitchen since before dawn. There is cold sliced ham and chicken salad, deviled eggs arranged in careful rows on 3 different platters, because 3 different women each insisted on contributing their own recipe, a molded gelatin salad shimmering faintly under the hall's fluorescent lights, dinner rolls still warm enough to release a faint thread of steam when broken open, and an assortment of relishes and pickles that someone's grandmother has been putting up every August for the past 30 years specifically for occasions exactly like this one. The seating arrangement, like everything else about the day, has been the subject of careful negotiation in the weeks leading up to the wedding, Ruth and Walter's mother trading lists back and forth, working out which relatives could be safely seated near each other, and which carried old grievances best kept at a respectable distance. The head table, where Eleanor and Walter sit now, flanked by their wedding party, faces out toward the assembled guests, another small architecture of public display, the newly married couple, positioned where everyone in the room can watch them eat their first meal together as husband and wife, can observe the small telling details of how they interact, whether they seem happy, whether the match looks, from the outside, like a good one. Nearby, the cake stands on its own small table near the head table, 3 tiers of white fondant, decorated with simple piped scrollwork, and a scattering of sugared flowers that Mrs. Pemberton's sister, who does cake work on the side, spent the better part of 2 days assembling. Atop it sits the cake topper, a small porcelain figure of a bride and groom that Ruth purchased specifically for this occasion from the same shop in the county seat where she bought her own cake topper 26 years earlier, a tiny detail of continuity that Ruth mentioned to Eleanor with evident pleasure while wrapping it carefully in tissue paper the week before the wedding. These figures, mass-produced but still treated with a kind of ceremonial significance, would typically be saved afterward, displayed somewhere in the new household. A small permanent souvenir of the day perched eventually on a shelf or inside a curio cabinet for decades to come, long after the cake itself has been eaten and forgotten. Cutting it follows its own small ritual, one that Eleanor has watched performed at every wedding she has ever attended, and is now, somewhat disorientingly, performing herself. Walter's hand closes over hers on the handle of the ornate cake knife, borrowed for the occasion from Walter's grandmother, and together they make the first cut, a moment Mr. Schaefer captures from 3 different angles, asking them to pause, to hold the position a beat longer, to try it again because the light from the window behind them was not quite right the first time. The symbolism of the shared first cut, the couple's first joint act of providing for their guests, a small enactment of the domestic partnership the marriage formally begins, is not lost on the older women watching from the surrounding tables, several of whom murmur their approval at the sight, a small satisfied chorus of women who have performed this same gesture themselves, decades earlier, in this same hall, or one very much like it. There are toasts, delivered by the best man and by Eleanor's father, both kept mercifully brief by the standards of the era, the best man offering a few warm, slightly awkward words about Walter's good character and steady nature, Eleanor's father managing only a handful of sentences before his voice catches noticeably on the final line, something about hoping Walter understands what a fortunate man he is today, a sentiment that draws a soft, collective sound of approval from the room and brings sudden tears to Eleanor's eyes, the first unguarded emotion she has allowed herself to show publicly all day, quickly absorbed by Dorothy's ready handkerchief, produced again from somewhere in the folds of her bridesmaid dress. The guest book sits on its own small table near the entrance to the hall, a slim, leather-bound volume with Eleanor and Walter's names embossed on the cover in gold script, purchased from a stationer 2 towns over and set out with a fountain pen tied to the table leg by a length of pale blue ribbon so that nobody can wander off with it. Throughout the reception, guests drift over in 2s and 3s to sign their names, some adding a brief well-wish beneath their signature, a small tradition of permanent record-keeping that will, decades from now, become one of the few surviving physical artifacts of exactly who attended this particular June afternoon, a document Eleanor will keep, eventually, in the same drawer as her wedding photographs, taken out occasionally over the following years to remind herself, and later her children, of who exactly had been there to witness the beginning. Wedding favours, in this era and in a town of this size, tend toward the modest and practical rather than the elaborate. Eleanor and Ruth settled, weeks earlier, on small mesh bags of sugared almonds tied with the same pale blue ribbon used on the guest book, a tradition with roots reaching back considerably further than either of them likely realizes. The bitter and sweet of the almond itself meant in older custom to represent the mixed nature of marriage, its sweetness and its trials both. Each guest, as they leave the reception hall later in the afternoon, will be handed one of these small bags by Carol, who has been assigned this particular task and takes it with enormous visible seriousness, standing near the door distributing them with the gravity of a soldier handing out medals. As the afternoon wears on, the reception settles into a looser, more sociable rhythm, the formal structure of the receiving line and the cake cutting giving way to something closer to an ordinary festive gathering. Someone has brought a portable record player, set up on a card table near the back wall of the hall, and a few of the younger guests begin dancing on the small cleared section of floor. Nothing too modern or too loud, the kind of dancing that fits comfortably within a church fellowship hall on a Saturday afternoon. Eleanor and Walter share the first dance, a custom by now well established even in towns this size, Walter's hand resting carefully at her waist, both of them moving with the slightly stiff self-consciousness of two people who know they are being watched. The rest of the room having paused, by unspoken agreement, to observe this particular small ritual before resuming their own conversations. There is a bouquet toss later in the afternoon, Eleanor turning her back to the cluster of unmarried young women who have gathered, giggling, near the centre of the room, tossing the small arrangement of white roses and stephanotis over her shoulder with more force than strictly necessary, watching over her shoulder as it is caught, amid considerable laughter, by her cousin's friend, a girl of about 19 who turns bright red at the implication and is teased about it for the remainder of the afternoon by everyone within earshot. Walter is subjected to his own parallel ritual a few minutes later, removing the garter from beneath Eleanor's skirt with theatrical, slightly embarrassed flourish, while the assembled male guests hoot encouragement, tossing it to a cluster of unmarried young men who catch it, or fail to catch it, amid their own round of good-natured ribbing. These small rituals, the bouquet, the garter, the dance, carry a lighter energy than the church ceremony did, a kind of permission to be playful that the morning's solemnity did not allow. Eleanor finds herself laughing more genuinely during this stretch of the afternoon than at almost any other point in the day, caught up, despite everything, in the simple pleasure of celebration, of being surrounded by people who genuinely wish her well, even if some portion of that goodwill is tangled up with the social evaluation that has been running underneath the whole day. But I want to be honest with you about something, because it would be easy telling this story to let the warmth of the dancing and the laughter paper over what is actually happening to Eleanor by this point in the afternoon, which is a slow, accumulating exhaustion that has very little to do with physical tiredness, though there is plenty of that too, her feet aching badly inside her shoes by now, the bodice of her dress still uncomfortably tight after hours of wear. What I mean is something closer to the exhaustion of sustained performance, the particular fatigue that comes from holding a single composed, cheerful expression across an entire day, hour after hour, in front of an audience that never entirely disperses, simply changes composition, new faces arriving as old ones drift toward the punch bowl or the dance floor, the audience itself never actually going away. There is a particular kind of tiredness specific to being watched continuously for the better part of 12 hours, watched and assessed and discussed, however kindly, by a community that has organized this entire elaborate day around the premise that today is supposed to represent the height of a young woman's happiness, and that any visible deviation from that prescribed happiness would register immediately as something worth remarking on, worth wondering about, worth a raised eyebrow over coffee in the weeks that followed. Eleanor has not had a single truly private moment since 4:50 this morning, save for the 90 seconds Dorothy and Marjorie carved out for her in the bedroom, hidden behind the careful screen of female solidarity. Every other minute of this day has belonged, in some measure, to other people's eyes. This is not a complaint Eleanor would ever voice, not today, possibly not ever. It is simply the texture of the day as she is actually living it, underneath the dress and the veil and the careful smile, a texture that the photographs being taken throughout the afternoon will never capture, because photographs capture surfaces, and surfaces are precisely what 1953 asked its brides to perfect. Around 4 in the afternoon, Ruth catches Eleanor's eye across the room and gives a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the side door, the signal both of them have been waiting for, the moment when the bride is expected to slip away and change into her going-away outfit, the final costume change of the day, marking the formal transition from wedding celebration to the beginning of married life proper. Eleanor follows her mother and Dorothy and Marjorie back into the small room off the fellowship hall that has served as her dressing room all day, where the going-away suit hangs waiting on a hook, a smart fitted dress in a soft dove grey, paired with matching gloves and a small hat with a short veil of its own, an outfit chosen carefully back in April to suggest both occasion and travel, formal enough for the remaining hour of farewells and casual enough for the train journey ahead. Getting out of the wedding dress takes nearly as long as getting into it did this morning, the long row of satin buttons requiring the same patient three-handed effort in reverse. And there is something quietly poignant about this moment, the dress finally coming free, Eleanor stepping out of it in her slip while Ruth carefully folds the satin and lace back into its tissue paper, preserving it for the years of storage ahead, for the eventual moment, decades from now, when a daughter of Eleanor's own might ask to see it, might even wear it herself if fashions permit. For now, though, it is simply being put away, the central costume of the entire day finished with its work, and Eleanor feels a small unexpected pang watching it disappear back into its box, a recognition that something has genuinely ended, even as something else is just beginning. The going-away outfit carried its own significant social weight in this era, a tradition that has mostly faded from American wedding custom in the decades since, but was, in 1953, considered an essential part of a properly executed wedding day. The bride's reappearance in this second outfit, descending whatever staircase or doorway the reception venue provided, served as a kind of formal cue to the assembled guests that the celebration was drawing to its close, that the couple would shortly depart for their honeymoon, and that this departure itself deserved its own small burst of ceremony. More rice thrown, perhaps tin cans tied to the back of whatever car would carry them to the train station, the groomsmen often competing to see who could attach the most elaborate string of cans and old shoes to the rear bumper without being caught in the act. Eleanor emerges from the dressing room transformed once again, the soft grey suit fitting her trim figure well, her hair, still set from this morning's careful work with Mrs. Hollis, now tucked beneath the small hat at an angle the magazines would approve of. The reception erupts into a fresh round of applause and good-natured commentary at the sight of her, and Walter, who has changed in a similar backroom into his own travelling suit, appears moments later to a matching wave of approval. The two of them now dressed for departure, for the part of the day that belongs, finally, almost entirely to the two of them rather than to the watching town. There are perhaps 20 minutes of final farewells, Eleanor moving once more through a smaller, more concentrated version of the receiving line, embracing her parents, her sister, her closest friends, accepting last words of advice and affection, before Walter's car, decorated now with the predicted string of cans rattling cheerfully behind it, pulls around to the front of the hall. The crowd follows them out onto the front steps, a fresh shower of rice falling around them as they make their way to the car. Eleanor laughing now in a way that feels, for the first time all day, almost entirely unguarded, the careful performance of the receiving line and the ceremony finally giving way to something closer to genuine, breathless relief. Her father is the last to embrace her before she climbs into the car, holding her a beat longer than strictly necessary. And when he finally releases her, his eyes are visibly damp, an emotion Eleanor has seen on her father's face perhaps twice before in her entire life. "Take care of her," he says to Walter gruffly, extending his hand, and Walter shakes it firmly, promises that he will, and there is something in the exchange between the two men, brief and formal as it is, that carries real weight. An old, traditional handing over of responsibility that both of them seem to understand and take seriously, even if neither could fully articulate what exactly is being transferred in that handshake. The drive to the train station takes perhaps 15 minutes, the small town giving way gradually to open country road, fields of young corn stretching green and orderly on either side, the cans tied to the bumper clattering a steady, cheerful percussion behind them the entire way. Eleanor sits close to Walter in the front seat, her gloved hand resting on his knee in a gesture that feels, after the formality of the entire day, almost shockingly intimate. The first unsupervised, unobserved closeness the two of them have shared since this morning. Neither of them says very much during the drive. There does not seem to be much that needs saying, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. The particular ease of two people who have just survived something enormous together and are beginning, tentatively, to exhale. Train travel for the honeymoon was, in 1953, still very much the standard for middle-class American couples in towns like this one, particularly in the years before interstate highway travel and commercial air travel became the more obvious choices a decade or so later. A train honeymoon carried its own particular romance, its own established choreography that magazines and etiquette guides discussed with almost as much specificity as they devoted to the wedding ceremony itself. The destination mattered, certainly. Niagara Falls remained, by a wide margin, the most popular honeymoon destination for couples across the entire country, so thoroughly associated with newlywed travel that the local hotels and shops there had built an entire industry around catering specifically to brides and grooms, complete with honeymoon suites, complimentary champagne, and staff trained to extend a particular kind of knowing courtesy to obviously newlywed guests. Eleanor and Walter, more modestly, are bound for a smaller lakeside resort town 6 hours north by rail, a place Walter's older brother honeymooned 3 years earlier and recommended warmly, more affordable than Niagara but offering, by all accounts, a comparable atmosphere of romantic seclusion. The station itself, when they arrive, is a small brick building with a single platform, the kind of station that sees perhaps 4 or 5 trains pass through each day. And there is a brief flurry of final goodbyes here too, several of the wedding party having followed in their own cars to see the couple off properly. More rice, more laughter, Carol crying openly now, overwhelmed by the accumulated emotion of the entire day, clinging to Eleanor in a fierce hug that nearly knocks her hat askew. And then, finally, the conductor's call, the hiss and clank of the train itself pulling into the station, and Eleanor and Walter climbing aboard together, finding their way to the small sleeping compartment Walter had reserved weeks earlier, the porter stowing their luggage with brisk efficiency before withdrawing and leaving them, for the first time all day, genuinely and completely alone. The compartment is small, panelled in dark varnished wood, with a narrow bench seat that converts, later in the evening, into a berth, a small fold-down table beneath the window, a brass reading lamp, the particular smell of train travel in this era, coal smoke and machine oil, and the faint mustiness of upholstery that has absorbed the scent of 10,000 previous passengers. Eleanor sits by the window as the train begins to move, watching her hometown slide past and then give way to open countryside, the fields and fence lines and occasional farmhouses rolling by in the long slanting light of late afternoon. And she becomes aware, gradually, sitting there in the rhythmic sway of the train, that her shoulders have begun, for the first time all day, to genuinely relax. There is no audience now, no receiving line, no watching congregation, no careful arrangement of features into the expected expression. Just Walter, sitting across the small compartment from her, loosening his tie with visible relief, and the steady clatter of the wheels on the rails beneath them, and the particular golden quality of the light coming through the window as the afternoon edges toward evening. They talk, for the first time all day in any unhurried way, about nothing in particular, about how tired Walter's feet are in his new dress shoes, about a comment Eleanor's great-aunt made in the receiving line that had struck her as funny in retrospect, about the lake town ahead and what they might do there over the coming week. It is ordinary conversation, the kind any two people might have, and there is something profoundly comforting in its ordinariness after the heightened ceremonial weight of everything that preceded it. Walter produces, from his jacket pocket, a small paper bag of the same sugared almonds that were distributed as favors at the reception, having apparently pocketed a handful before they left, and offers Eleanor one with a small, slightly sheepish grin, an unexpectedly playful gesture that makes her laugh, genuinely, for what feels like the first time all day without any particular performance attached to it. They eat the almonds together, watching the countryside slide past, and somewhere in this small, quiet, unremarkable moment, eating stolen wedding favors in a swaying train compartment, Eleanor feels something settle in her chest that has been unsettled since 4:50 this morning. Not resolved exactly, not every question answered, but settled, the way a held breath finally releases, the way the body remembers eventually that it is allowed to relax. Dinner is served in the dining car around 7, a formal little ritual all its own. White tablecloths and heavy silver-plated cutlery laid out on tables bolted to the floor against the train's gentle, constant sway. The dining car steward, recognizing newlyweds with the practiced eye of a man who has served hundreds of them over the years, the conductor having presumably mentioned it, or perhaps simply something in the particular way Eleanor and Walter look at each other giving it away, seats them at a table near the window and produces, unbidden, a small bud vase with a single carnation, a tiny kind gesture that makes Eleanor's eyes prick unexpectedly. The meal itself is simple but carefully prepared. A choice between roast chicken or a small beef cutlet, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked soft in the style of the era, a roll and butter, and for dessert, a wedge of yellow cake with chocolate frosting that the steward brings out with a small flourish. On the house, he explains, for the happy couple, and Eleanor and Walter exchange a look across the table that holds, for just a moment, something like genuine delight. The small, accumulating kindnesses of strangers along this journey beginning to feel like a kind of quiet blessing laid over the whole undertaking. Outside the window, the Ohio countryside gradually gives way to denser woodland as the train climbs north, the light fading slowly through the long blue hour of early summer evening. Farmhouse windows beginning to glow yellow here and there in the deepening dusk, a passing glimpse of someone's ordinary evening. A woman hanging wash on a line even this late, a man walking from a barn toward a lit kitchen window, small fragments of other people's lives glimpsed and gone in the space of a few seconds, the train carrying Eleanor and Walter steadily onward into whatever their own life together is about to become. They arrive at the lake town a little after 9, the small station lit by a handful of electric lamps, moths circling thickly in the warm night air around each one. A taxi, arranged in advance by Walter's brother who had stayed at the same establishment, carries them the short distance to the hotel, a rambling wood-frame building set back from the lake shore behind a wide porch lined with white wicker furniture, the kind of place that has clearly hosted generations of honeymooning couples, and knows exactly how to manage the particular blend of celebration and discretion the occasion requires. The clerk at the front desk, an older woman with kind eyes and an unhurried manner, checks them in with the same practiced, knowing courtesy as the dining car steward, sliding the room key across the counter along with a small printed card, listing the breakfast hours and a gentle reminder that room service is available, should the newlyweds prefer not to come down for breakfast in the morning. A discreet acknowledgement of exactly what tonight represents, that makes Eleanor's cheeks colour faintly even as she appreciates the woman's tact. Their room, on the second floor, overlooks the lake, a wide, dark expanse just visible now in the moonlight through the gauzy curtains, the sound of small waves lapping gently against a dock somewhere below the window, a sound entirely unlike anything in Eleanor's hometown, where the nearest body of water of any size is a creek too shallow to swim in. The room itself is simple and clean, a double bed with a white chenille spread, a small writing desk, a single upholstered chair near the window, the particular faded floral wallpaper that seems to furnish every modest resort hotel of this era across the entire country. I want to be careful and honest with you here, in the way the rest of this story has tried to be careful and honest, because what happens next in Eleanor's actual experience belongs properly to her, and to the private threshold every bride of this era crossed largely alone, without adequate preparation, carrying whatever fragments of guidance her mother had managed to offer 2 nights ago on the edge of her childhood bed. What I can tell you, What the broader historical record makes clear, even where any single woman's private experience remains necessarily her own, is that this moment, the wedding night, spoken of so rarely and so vaguely throughout the entire preceding courtship and engagement, represented for an enormous number of brides across the country in this exact period a genuine, unrehearsed unknown, arriving at the end of a day that had rehearsed and choreographed nearly everything else down to the smallest detail. There was real fear in many of these rooms. Fear born not necessarily of the act itself, but of the silence surrounding it, the absence of honest information passed from one generation of women to the next. There was also often real tenderness. Two young people equally inexperienced, equally nervous, finding their way together through something neither of them had been properly taught, extending toward each other a patience and gentleness that the etiquette manuals never thought to mention, because etiquette manuals, for all their exhaustive specificity about wedding invitations and seating charts, had nothing useful to say about this. Eleanor and Walter, in their own room overlooking their own dark lake, are in this sense simply one more pair among thousands that June, working their way through something profoundly significant with almost no honest map, relying instead on whatever basic decency and care they had managed to build toward each other over the preceding 14 months. Which turns out, as it did for a great many couples of this era, to be enough to carry them through the night with something approaching real gentleness, even amid the genuine uncertainty of it. What I find myself thinking about, considering this part of the story, is not the specifics of what happened in that room, which belong properly to Eleanor and Walter alone, and to no one else, not even to us, all these decades later. What I find myself thinking about is the strange, almost unbearable contrast between the exhaustive, meticulous preparation that governed every other hour of this day, the dress, the veil, the seating chart, the receiving line, the precise order of the processional, and the near total absence of preparation for this single hour, arguably the most significant private threshold of the entire day. An entire culture had organized itself with extraordinary precision around managing a bride's public presentation, her appearance, her composure, her performed happiness, while leaving her almost entirely undefended against the private unknown that public presentation was, in some sense, always building toward. That contrast says something true and a little heartbreaking about what this era valued, and what it did not. Morning comes softly into that room above the lake. The light, different from anything Eleanor knows at home, reflected up off the water in shifting, pale patterns across the ceiling. She wakes before Walter does, lying still for a long moment, taking inventory of herself in the unfamiliar quiet, the strange new fact of her own married body in a married bed beside a man who is now, legally and permanently, her husband. There is no single clean word for what she feels in that quiet half hour before Walter stirs. Something tender, something a little raw, something that resembles relief almost as much as it resembles the beginning of affection deepening into something steadier. She watches a thin curtain of lake light move slowly across the far wall and does not try too hard to name the feeling. Some things she is discovering already do not need naming to be real. They take breakfast that first morning on the wide porch overlooking the water, the same wicker furniture from the night before, now scattered with other honeymooning couples easily identifiable by a particular shared quality, a softness around the eyes, a tendency to reach for each other's hands without quite seeming to notice they are doing it, the unmistakable, slightly dazed contentment of people only one day into a brand new arrangement of their entire lives. The hotel serves a simple breakfast, soft scrambled eggs not unlike the ones Ruth made yesterday morning in another life entirely, thick slices of toast, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and Eleanor finds herself, somewhere over her second cup, laughing at something small Walter says. A genuine, easy laugh entirely unlike the careful, performed laughter of yesterday's reception. The week that follows settles into its own small rhythm, the lake town offering exactly the kind of unhurried, undemanding pleasures a honeymoon of this era and this modest budget was designed to provide. There are slow mornings on the porch, afternoons spent on a rented rowboat that Walter handles with more confidence than skill, the oars occasionally catching awkwardly and sending up a spray that makes Eleanor shriek and laugh in equal measure. There is a small amusement pier, a short walk along the shore, with a modest carousel and a shooting gallery where Walter wins, after several embarrassing misses, a small stuffed rabbit that Eleanor will keep for the rest of her life, long after the rest of the souvenirs from this week have been lost or discarded, tucked eventually into a drawer in a house neither of them has yet seen, then later still onto a shelf in a different house entirely, the rabbit somehow surviving every move they will ever make. There are quiet evenings too, dinners at the hotel's modest dining room, evening walks along the shoreline as the light fails and the lake turns the color of pewter, conversations that range gradually beyond the careful supervised topics of their courtship into something more genuinely unguarded. Eleanor finds herself telling Walter things she had not planned to tell him, small private fears and half-formed hopes about the life ahead of them, and he listens with an attentiveness that surprises her, a quality of patient interest she had not fully registered in him before, courting under the watchful eyes of porches and parlors. There is something about the privacy of this week, the simple absence of any watching audience, that allows both of them to become gradually more genuinely themselves with each other than the entire preceding 14 months of supervised courtship ever permitted. I think this matters this week away from the town's collective gaze, more than the wedding day itself in some ways, though it receives almost none of the ceremonial attention the wedding day commanded. It is here, in this unremarkable lake town, in slow mornings and rowboat afternoons and evening walks along the shore, that Eleanor and Walter actually begin the genuine work of becoming known to each other, work that the elaborate machinery of courtship and engagement and wedding ceremony, for all its careful choreography, never actually required of them until now. The town back home built an enormous, intricate structure to manage their public transition from single to married. Nobody built anything at all to help them manage the private, ongoing work of actually learning to live as two people sharing one life. And so they are left, in this quiet week, to begin building that themselves, slowly, almost by accident, in the unglamorous, ordinary moments between the planned activities. One evening, sitting together on the porch after the other honeymooning couples have drifted off to their own rooms, Eleanor finds herself telling Walter about the wedding shower her mother's church circle hosted for her back in May, an event that in the rush of everything since she had not thought much about until this quiet moment brings it back. It had been held in the fellowship hall of the same church where they were married. 24 women gathered on a Sunday afternoon, gifts wrapped in tissue paper and tied with ribbons that Eleanor had been instructed to save, each bow carefully removed and threaded onto a paper plate, building, over the course of the afternoon, an elaborate paper bouquet that tradition held would predict how many children Eleanor would eventually have, the precise number of unbroken ribbons determining the count, a small, silly, beloved superstition that every woman in the room had played along with despite, presumably, knowing it carried no real predictive power. The gifts themselves had been almost entirely practical, the household shower of this era functioning as a kind of communal dowry, assembling piece by piece the material foundation of the new household Eleanor was about to establish. Dish towels, embroidered with her new monogram by women who had spent weeks on the careful needlework, a set of mixing bowls in graduated sizes, a coffee percolator nearly identical to the one Ruth has used Eleanor's entire life, linens carefully chosen and often handmade, pillowcases and tablecloths that would furnish the new home from its very first week. This was the trousseau tradition in its mid-century American form, less elaborate than the trousseaus of wealthier brides in earlier generations, who might have assembled entire wardrobes and complete sets of monogrammed household linens over years of careful preparation, but carrying the same essential function, equipping a young woman materially and symbolically for the domestic role she was about to formally assume. Walter listens to all of this with genuine interest, asking small questions, and Eleanor finds herself telling the story, noticing things about that shower she had not fully registered at the time, caught up as she was in the busy social performance of receiving and opening gifts in front of an attentive audience. She remembers now, with new clarity, the particular quality of the conversation that had run underneath the gift opening. Women in their 30s and 40s and 50s offering small, fragmentary pieces of advice between gifts. Advice about managing a household budget, about a particular trick for getting scorch marks out of an ironing board cover, about which of the men at the plant where Walter worked were known to be difficult and which were considered good company. An entire informal curriculum passed casually between women over cake and punch, teaching Eleanor things no etiquette manual had thought to include, the practical, lived knowledge of running a household that existed almost entirely in oral tradition. Woman to woman, undocumented and essential, the honeymoon ends, as all honeymoons of this modest week-long variety eventually did, with a return train journey that feels in nearly every way like the mirror image of the one that carried them north a week earlier, except that something between Eleanor and Walter has shifted in the intervening days, a comfort settling into the space between them that had not quite existed before. They arrive back at the small station in their hometown on a Saturday afternoon almost exactly 1 week after their wedding, and the first thing Eleanor notices, stepping down from the train onto the familiar platform, is how strange it feels that no one has gathered to meet them. No rice, no cheering crowd, simply Walter's father waiting beside the car to drive them the short distance to the small rented house on Linden Street that will be their first home together. This transition, I think, deserves more attention than it typically receives in any account of a 1950s wedding, because it represents the genuine beginning of the actual life the entire preceding year and a half of courtship and engagement and wedding day was, in some sense, simply an elaborate preparation for. The house on Linden Street is small, a modest 2-bedroom rental that Walter secured back in the spring, furnished now with the accumulated gifts of the wedding shower and the wedding itself, the dish towels and mixing bowls and percolator finally finding their places in a kitchen that belongs for the first time entirely to Eleanor to manage. There is a particular kind of disorientation in this first homecoming, walking into rooms that are simultaneously brand new and already somehow expected to function as home. Eleanor moves through the small house that first evening, opening cupboards, finding the careful arrangements her mother and Dorothy made during the week of the honeymoon. They had come by, apparently, with Walter's mother to put away the wedding gifts and stock the pantry with basic provisions. A final act of maternal care extended one last time before Eleanor is left, fully to manage this household on her own. She finds in the small icebox a covered dish of her mother's chicken and dumplings, still faintly warm somehow, or perhaps simply recently delivered, with a note tucked under the lid in Ruth's familiar handwriting. "Welcome home, dear. Use what you need and do not worry about the rest." Eleanor sits at her own kitchen table, a fact that still feels strange and new every time she registers it consciously, and reads the note twice, feeling something complicated move through her chest, gratitude and grief tangled together in a way she is becoming accustomed to feeling about most things connected to this entire transition. Her mother's care follows her even here, into this new house, even as the structure of her daily life has shifted permanently away from her mother's kitchen, her mother's rhythms, her mother's house. She will see Ruth regularly, of course. This is a small town. Her parents live only a 15-minute walk away, but something has changed in the fundamental architecture of their relationship regardless. A shift that no amount of regular visiting will entirely undo. There is the matter of the name, too, a small bureaucratic detail that nonetheless carries real symbolic weight. Eleanor spends part of that first week back attending to the practical business of becoming, officially Mrs. Walter, whatever his surname happens to be. Let us simply leave it unspoken, the way history so often leaves these particular women's full names unspoken, folded entirely into their husbands' identities in the public record. She visits the courthouse to have her driver's license updated. She writes to the bank to change the name on her small savings account, the one she built up carefully over her years working at the library, watching the teller cross out her old name and write in the new one with a kind of bureaucratic indifference that does not register for him as anything significant at all, simply routine paperwork, while for Eleanor it represents something closer to a small, quiet erasure, the legal disappearance of the name she answered to for 22 years, replaced now by a name that belonged, until 8 days ago, entirely to a different family. This is, I think, one of the genuinely overlooked aspects of what marriage actually demanded of a woman in this period. Something so completely normalized that it rarely received any conscious examination at the time. A bride did not simply gain a husband, she surrendered, in a very literal, legal and social sense, her own name, her own independent financial identity, frequently her own employment, and stepped instead into a kind of secondary identity, defined officially and permanently in relation to her husband, Mrs. Walter, whatever his surname. Not Eleanor precisely, though everyone who knew her would of course continue to call her Eleanor in private conversation, but on every official document, every formal introduction, every piece of correspondence addressed to the household, she would now exist primarily as an extension of him, her own name folded inside his the way the veil had folded over her face for the walk down the aisle, lifted only by permission, only at the appropriate sanctioned moment. I do not think Eleanor herself, standing at that bank counter watching the teller cross out her maiden name, fully articulated all of this to herself in these exact terms. It is easier with the distance of decades for us to see clearly what was at the time simply the unremarkable water everyone swam in, but something in her did register it, even without the words for it. A small persistent awareness of having become, in some official sense, slightly less visible than she had been the week before. Her own particular self subsumed now into a joint identity that the law and the church and the entire surrounding culture considered both natural and correct. The first months of married life settle, gradually, into their own particular rhythm, one that Eleanor learns largely through trial and observation, since nobody, true to the pattern established throughout her entire courtship and engagement, sat her down for any comprehensive instruction in how to actually run a household day to day. She had watched her mother do it for 22 years, of course, had absorbed a great deal simply through proximity, but watching and doing turn out to be different undertakings entirely, and Eleanor spends the better part of that first autumn making small private mistakes that she corrects through quiet trial and error, rather than through any acknowledged process of learning. Mornings begin early, earlier than Eleanor was ever required to rise in her parents' house, because Walter leaves for the plant at 6:15, and expects, as the pamphlets and magazine columns she absorbed without quite meaning to had taught her to expect of herself, a proper breakfast before he goes. She learns to manage the stove's particular temperament, learns which burner runs hot and which runs slow, learns the precise timing required to have eggs and toast and coffee ready at exactly the moment Walter comes downstairs dressed for work, a small domestic choreography that takes weeks to perfect, and that she perfects almost entirely alone, in the quiet, unwitnessed hours of early morning, with no audience to either praise or criticize her progress. The days themselves stretch out long and largely solitary, a fact that surprises Eleanor more than she expected it to. Accustomed as she had been to the busy, peopled rhythm of the library, the steady stream of patrons and colleagues that filled her working hours for the past several years. The house on Linden Street, by contrast, is quiet for most of the day. The work of maintaining it, the washing, the ironing, the marketing, the cleaning, the meal preparation, performed almost entirely in solitude, punctuated only by the occasional visit from Ruth or from Dorothy, who married her own steady young man 8 months later and moves herself through a parallel version of this same transition, the two friends comparing notes in careful, guarded language over coffee at each other's kitchen tables. It is in these kitchen conversations, more than anywhere else, that something like honest communication finally begins to happen between the women of Eleanor's generation, conversations conducted in the relative privacy of a friend's kitchen rather than the public stage of a wedding day or a church social, where the careful performance required everywhere else can finally relax just slightly into something more genuine. Dorothy admits, over coffee one autumn afternoon, that she still does not entirely understand her own husband's moods, that there are evenings when he comes home from work silent and short-tempered, and she has learned simply to manage around it rather than ask what is wrong, because asking, she has discovered, tends to make things worse rather than better. Eleanor finds herself nodding, recognizing something of her own early adjustments to Walter's occasional silences, the particular skill, never explicitly taught but somehow absorbed anyway, of reading a husband's mood and adjusting the household's emotional temperature accordingly. This is, I think, one of the genuine, unglamorous forms of resilience that an entire generation of American women developed during this period, almost entirely without acknowledgement, certainly without any cultural celebration of the skill involved. The capacity to manage, smooth, anticipate, absorb, to keep a household's emotional weather calm, regardless of the private weather happening inside oneself, was a genuinely demanding, sophisticated form of labor, even though the culture surrounding these women rarely framed it as labor at all, preferring instead to describe it as simply what a good wife did, naturally, as though it required no skill or effort, as though it were closer to instinct than to learned, practiced competence. There is a particular Sunday, perhaps 3 months into the marriage, that Eleanor will remember for years afterward, though nothing dramatic happens during it, nothing that would warrant inclusion in any conventional account of her life. Walter comes home from a difficult week at the plant. There had been some trouble with a supervisor, details he shares only in fragments over dinner, his jaw tight in a way Eleanor has learnt to recognize, and retreats after the meal into a silence that fills the small house uncomfortably, the kind of silence that 6 months ago Eleanor would not have known how to read at all. Now, though, she understands something of its shape. She does not press him for explanation. She does not perform cheerfulness at him, the way the pamphlets advised, the bright ribbon in the hair, the eager listening ear. She simply sits with him, in the small front room, each of them with their own quiet occupation, Walter with the newspaper, Eleanor with a piece of mending, the silence between them companionable rather than strained. Two people who have learned, in a relatively short span of months, how to occupy the same room without demanding anything of each other beyond simple presence. It is a small moment, almost nothing, and yet Eleanor recognizes it, sitting there with her needle moving through Walter's shirt collar, as something real, something earned rather than performed, a genuine intimacy built not from the elaborate machinery of the wedding day, but from these small, unwitnessed, ordinary evenings, accumulating one by one into something that might, eventually, with enough of them, become something close to what she once imagined love might feel like, even if it arrived by a route entirely different from the one the library novels had promised her. There is a particular pressure that begins to surface within the first year of marriage in towns like this one, a pressure so pervasive that it rarely needed to be spoken aloud, though it was spoken aloud anyway, regularly, by relatives who considered the question entirely appropriate for casual conversation. When are you two planning to start a family? Eleanor hears some version of this question at nearly every social gathering she attends throughout that first autumn and winter, asked by aunts and church ladies and her own grandmother, with a casualness that belies how genuinely loaded the question actually is, how much weight it carries for a young woman barely settled into the rhythms of her new household, still learning how her own marriage actually works before being asked, repeatedly, when she intends to complicate it further with the demands of motherhood. The cultural expectation in 1953 America held that children should arrive reasonably promptly after marriage, certainly within the first 2 or 3 years, and a couple who delayed longer than that without explanation became, gradually, the subject of a particular kind of gentle but persistent speculation, whispered about at church socials, wandered over in the kind of careful, indirect language women of this era used to discuss anything they considered too delicate for direct mention. Eleanor feels this pressure even though she and Walter have not yet, in these early months, discussed any specific timeline between themselves. The question existing for her primarily as something imposed from outside, from the watching community, rather than something she and Walter have actually decided together as the two people whose lives it will most directly affect. There was, too, a whole separate etiquette governing how Eleanor was now expected to formally announce her new married status to the wider social circle she had inherited through Walter, a custom already beginning to fade somewhat by 1953 but still observed carefully in towns of this size. Calling cards printed with her new married name arrived from the stationer about 2 weeks after the wedding, and Eleanor spent several afternoons that first month making formal introductory visits to Walter's older female relatives and to the wives of his colleagues at the plant, leaving a card if the lady of the house happened to be out, sitting for a brief, carefully managed quarter-hour of conversation if she happened to be in. These visits were not purely social, they functioned as a kind of formal registration of Eleanor's arrival into a new social network. Each woman she called upon taking her own private measure of the new bride, filing away an impression that would shape in small ways how readily Eleanor would be welcomed into the various church circles and ladies' auxiliaries and informal coffee groups that constituted the actual texture of a married woman's social life in this town. She kept a small notebook, at her mother's suggestion, recording which calls she had made and which had been returned, a quiet, methodical project of relationship building conducted through the same careful, formalized etiquette that had governed nearly every other stage of her transition into married life. This points to something larger about the texture of married life in a small town during this period, something worth sitting with for a moment. Marriage in this world was never entirely a private arrangement between two people. However much the wedding ceremony's language of two becoming one might suggest a closed, self-contained unit, it remained, throughout its earliest years especially, a matter of considerable ongoing public interest, the community continuing to observe, comment on, and gently pressure the new household toward conformity with established expectations, much the way it had observed and assessed the courtship and the wedding day itself. There was no clean line where the public performance of the wedding ended and private married life began. The public gaze simply continued, in a lower, more diffuse form, woven now into the ordinary fabric of church attendance and grocery store encounters and Sunday dinners with extended family, rather than concentrated into the single intense day of the wedding itself. Eleanor finds herself, moving through all of this, developing a particular kind of quiet competence at managing the gap between her private interior life and the version of herself she presents to the watching town, a skill that I think deserves recognition as one of the genuine, if largely uncelebrated, achievements of women of her generation. She learns to answer the children question with a light, non-committal warmth, "Oh, we'll see in good time, I imagine," that satisfies the asker without revealing anything of the actual, ongoing conversation happening between her and Walter behind closed doors, a conversation that involves real uncertainty, real practical concern about whether they can afford a larger family on Walter's wages just yet, real private feeling that Eleanor has no intention of sharing with her grandmother at a church supper, however warmly the question is asked. I think about Eleanor often, developing this skill, and I find myself genuinely admiring it, the careful, constant labor of maintaining a coherent, acceptable public self, while a much more complicated, uncertain private self continues its own separate existence underneath. This is not duplicity exactly, though it might look like duplicity from a certain angle. It is something closer to a survival skill, developed by necessity, by an entire generation of women living inside a culture that offered very little space for genuine ambivalence, genuine uncertainty, genuine complexity to be expressed openly. The performance of composed, contented femininity was not optional. It was, in a very real sense, the price of social acceptance, the toll a woman paid for continued good standing within her community, and Eleanor, like countless women around her, learns to pay it fluently, almost without conscious effort, the way you learn any skill practiced daily enough for long enough. This is not to say that the marriage itself is unhappy. or that Eleanor's private feelings are uniformly difficult ones requiring careful concealment. There is real warmth growing between her and Walter throughout that first year, real moments of genuine ease and even, increasingly, genuine pleasure in each other's company. Evenings that pass easily, small jokes that have become already private shorthand between them, the particular comfort of a body grown familiar beside her own in the dark. But the warmth and the difficulty exist alongside each other, woven together in a way the culture surrounding Eleanor had almost no framework for acknowledging, insisting instead on a simpler, cleaner narrative, happy bride, happy wife, happy mother soon to come, that left no real room for the more complicated, more honest truth of what marriage in this world actually felt like from the inside, for a woman living through it rather than observing it from a respectful, admiring distance. There was no magazine column written for the woman who felt both things genuinely, no etiquette guide acknowledging that contentment and constraint could occupy the very same Tuesday afternoon, the very same load of laundry hung out to dry in the very same backyard. Eleanor simply learnt to hold both without much language for either, which is perhaps its own quiet kind of education, one no pamphlet ever offered her directly. Not every marriage in the town fares as gently as Eleanor's does, and it would be dishonest to tell this story without acknowledging that. There is a woman 2 streets over, married the same June as Eleanor, whose husband drinks more than is comfortable for anyone in the household to discuss openly, and whose composed, smiling presence at church each Sunday Eleanor has learned, gradually, to read more carefully than she once did, recognizing now the particular tightness around the eyes that does not quite match the easy warmth of the smile beneath it. There is another woman, older, married for nearly a decade now, whose husband Eleanor has heard described, in careful, indirect language passed between her mother and her mother's friends, as a difficult man, a man whose moods govern the household with an authority nobody in the family dares challenge openly. Divorce existed as a legal option throughout this period, certainly, but it carried a social cost in a town like this one that made it, for most women, something closer to a last and devastating resort than a genuine, accessible choice. A divorced woman in 1953 small-town America faced a particular, specific kind of social diminishment, whispered about, quietly excluded from certain social circles, regarded by a portion of the community with an unspoken suspicion that something about her, rather than her marriage, had failed. The economic reality compounded the social one. A woman who had left her own employment upon marrying, as Eleanor did, often had no independent income to fall back on, no recent work history, limited prospects for rebuilding an independent life outside the household her marriage had constructed around her. The combination of social stigma and economic vulnerability kept a great many difficult marriages intact throughout this period, not necessarily because the women involved lacked the courage to leave, but because the actual practical pathways out of an unhappy marriage were narrow, costly, and fraught with consequences that extended far beyond the marriage itself. I do not say this to suggest that every marriage of this era was secretly miserable beneath its composed surface, because that would be just as inaccurate as the opposite, equally false narrative of universal contentment that the etiquette manuals and magazine columns of the period worked so hard to project. Most marriages, like most human arrangements of any era, contain some genuine mixture of both, real affection alongside real frustration, real partnership alongside real inequality, moments of authentic connection woven through long stretches of simple, unremarkable routine. Eleanor's own marriage, as it continues to develop over that first year and into the years that follow, settles into something that I think most honest observers, including Eleanor herself, looking back decades later, would describe as a genuinely good marriage, built less on the romantic intensity she once imagined as a younger woman reading library novels, and more on a steady, accumulating respect and tenderness that grows, gradually, season by season, into something she comes to value as deeply as any storybook passion she might once have hoped for. But the goodness of Eleanor's particular marriage does not erase the larger truth this story is trying to hold on to, which is that the entire system surrounding marriage in this period, The courtship rules, the engagement etiquette, the wedding day's elaborate public performance, the silence around the wedding night, the social and economic pressures keeping women inside marriages regardless of their private quality, was built primarily to manage and contain women's choices rather than to genuinely serve their well-being or their happiness. Some women, like Eleanor, found real contentment within that system almost despite its limitations. Others did not, and had very little recourse, very little voice, very little acknowledged space to even name what they were missing, let alone seek a different path. There is something else worth understanding about how a wedding of Eleanor's particular size and formality actually came to exist at all, something that ran underneath every decision discussed so far, without ever being stated outright at the time, and that is the matter of money, who provided it, and what that provision was understood to mean. Convention in this era held firmly that the bride's family bore the primary financial responsibility for the wedding itself, the ceremony, the flowers, the reception, the dress, while the groom's family was expected to cover a narrower, specific set of costs, the rehearsal dinner chief among them, along with the honeymoon and often the engagement ring itself. This division was not simply a practical accounting convenience, it carried real symbolic weight, understood by nearly everyone in this culture, as part of the broader transaction the marriage itself represented. The bride's family demonstrating, through the visible expense of the wedding, both their genuine affection for their daughter and their own family's respectability and means, a kind of public investment that the entire watching community would assess alongside everything else about the day. Eleanor's father, in the months leading up to the wedding, had quiet, careful conversations with Ruth about the budget, conversations Eleanor was not entirely privy to but understood, in broad outline, were happening somewhere in the background of all her own dress fittings and flower selections. There was real financial strain involved, more than Eleanor fully grasped at the time, her father drawing down a portion of his savings, deferring a planned repair to the store's delivery truck, in order to provide the kind of wedding he felt his daughter, and by extension his own family's standing in the town, required. This was common practice across the country in this period, families of modest means stretching themselves financially, sometimes considerably, to provide daughters with weddings that matched, or came reasonably close to matching, the prevailing community standard, because a wedding perceived as too modest could itself become a subject of unkind commentary, a small mark against the family's reputation that nobody wanted to risk, regardless of the actual financial sacrifice required to avoid it. The rehearsal dinner, 2 evenings before the wedding, fell to Walter's family to host, as convention dictated, a smaller, more intimate gathering than the wedding reception itself, held at a modest restaurant in town that did not ordinarily host private parties but made an exception, as it occasionally did for occasions of this kind. It was here, at this smaller gathering, that Eleanor first met several of Walter's more distant relatives, aunts and cousins travelling in from out of state, the evening carrying its own particular pressure, a kind of preliminary audition before the larger performance of the wedding day itself. Eleanor acutely aware throughout the meal that she was being assessed, gently but unmistakably, by a new set of relatives whose approval mattered nearly as much, in its own way, as her own family's had mattered to Walter throughout his courtship of her. There was toasting at this dinner too, more informal than what would follow at the reception, Walter's father offering a brief warm welcome to Eleanor into the family, a gesture that moved her more than she expected, given how recently she had felt, throughout the long process of courtship and engagement, like an outsider being evaluated rather than a future daughter genuinely being welcomed. It was a small thing, that toast, 2 sentences at most, but Eleanor would remember it for years afterward as one of the moments that made the abstract, frightening idea of joining an entirely new family feel, suddenly, a little more like an actual possibility, rather than simply an obligation she had agreed to without fully understanding its weight. There were other small rituals folded into Eleanor's wedding day that I have not yet mentioned, smaller details that nonetheless carried genuine weight within the tradition, the kind of details a bride of this era absorbed almost without conscious thought, having watched them performed at every wedding she attended throughout her childhood and adolescence. The old rhyme governed a portion of her preparation that morning. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue in a sixpence in her shoe, a small piece of folk superstition stretching back generations. Each element meant to ward off some different category of misfortune, to bless the marriage with continuity and luck and protection against the various small disasters that might threaten a new household. Eleanor's something old was her grandmother's pearl earrings, the same ones Marjorie searched out from the jewellery box that morning, already carrying the weight of 3 previous brides in the family who wore them before her. Her something new was the dress itself, purchased specifically for this day and never worn before. Her something borrowed was a handkerchief belonging to Ruth, edged in delicate tatted lace that Ruth's own mother had made decades earlier, tucked into the small beaded handbag Eleanor carried tucked against her bouquet during the ceremony. And her something blue was a small ribbon sewn discreetly into the inside hem of her dress where no one would see it, but where its presence, Eleanor's mother assured her, mattered regardless of visibility, the tradition concerned with private blessing rather than public display. The sixpence in her shoe came from Walter's grandmother, an old coin she had carried at her own wedding decades earlier, and pressed into Eleanor's palm 2 days before, with the particular solemnity older women in this culture brought to passing down such small, accumulated traditions. A coin meant to ensure the new household would never want for prosperity. There is something worth noticing in how thoroughly this small rhyme, repeated at countless weddings across the country that same June, across decades before it and decades after, managed to compress an enormous amount of anxious hope into 5 small physical objects. A bride going into marriage in this era carried real substantial uncertainty about what awaited her, financially, emotionally, physically, in ways the etiquette manuals so carefully avoided discussing directly. The folk tradition of these small charms offered a kind of displaced reassurance, a way of acting on that uncertainty through ritual and object rather than through honest conversation, a pattern that I think characterizes a great deal of how this culture managed its brides' very real and legitimate anxieties, channeling them into superstition and symbolism rather than into direct, honest preparation. The wedding Eleanor experienced, modest and Protestant and solidly middle class, was of course only one variation among many that existed across the country that same June. A Catholic wedding in this same decade, in a town not too different from Eleanor's own, would have followed a noticeably different architecture. The ceremony itself folded into a full nuptial mass that could run considerably longer than the brief, focused Protestant service Eleanor experienced, with additional ritual elements, the unity candle in some parishes, the formal blessing of rings by the priest, communion shared by the couple at the altar before the assembled congregation, the whole occasion carrying a weightier, more explicitly sacramental character that Protestant ceremonies of this era, with their emphasis on the simpler exchange of vows, generally did not replicate. A Jewish wedding of the same period, meanwhile, would have looked different again, the ceremony conducted beneath a chuppah, the canopy symbolizing the new household the couple was establishing together, the breaking of the glass at the ceremony's conclusion, a tradition with its own deep history reaching back centuries, the reception that followed, often built around its own distinct culinary and musical traditions, entirely separate from the chicken salad and gelatin molds of Eleanor's fellowship hall breakfast. And weddings among Black American families in this same decade, particularly in the South but also in northern cities where the Great Migration had relocated so many families over the preceding decades, carried their own rich, distinct traditions, layered with both the broader American wedding customs of the period and specific cultural and religious traditions, all of it unfolding under the additional, constant weight of segregation and discrimination that shaped where ceremonies could be held, which photographers and caterers and florists would serve Black families, which churches and reception halls remained open to them, and which did not, a reality entirely absent from Eleanor's own experience that same June, her whiteness and her town's particular demographic composition, sparing her from a set of obstacles that countless other brides across the country faced, as an unavoidable additional layer atop everything else this day already demanded of them. Economic variation mattered enormously too, perhaps more than any of these other distinctions. A wedding among a wealthier family in a larger city might have included a formal sit-down dinner reception at a hotel ballroom rather than a church fellowship hall, professional musicians rather than a borrowed record player, a trousseau assembled over months of dedicated shopping trips rather than the modest household shower that furnished Eleanor's kitchen. A wedding among a poorer family, meanwhile, particularly in rural areas where cash remained scarce throughout this period, regardless of the broader post-war prosperity beginning to reshape much of urban and suburban America, might have been a considerably simpler affair entirely, a brief ceremony at the local courthouse, or a small home wedding in the front parlor, a reception consisting of little more than cake and coffee shared among immediate family, the elaborate machinery of bridal magazines and etiquette manuals existing, for these families, as an aspirational fantasy glimpsed in magazine pages rather than a lived reality they could afford to replicate. Eleanor's wedding sits somewhere in the comfortable middle of this broad American spectrum, modest by the standards of wealthier urban families, but solidly respectable by the standards of her own small town, every element of it chosen with careful attention to a particular, recognizable register of middle-class propriety that her community would read correctly, without confusion, as appropriate to a family of her father's station and reputation. Let us move forward now, gently, the way memory itself tends to move, skipping over long stretches of ordinary time to arrive somewhere further down the road. It is 1978 now, 25 years almost exactly since that June morning Eleanor lay awake at 4:50 doing arithmetic in the dark. She is 47 years old, sitting at her own kitchen table in a different house than the one on Linden Street, a larger house they moved into a decade ago as Walter's position at the plant steadily improved. The small rented rooms of their first married years long since exchanged for something more permanent, more genuinely theirs. Her daughter Susan, 23 years old now, and engaged herself, sits across the table, the wedding album open between them, its black pages soft and slightly brittle at the edges from decades of careful handling. Susan is asking questions her own daughter's generation has begun asking more openly than Eleanor's ever did. Questions about what the wedding day actually felt like, not simply what it looked like in the careful, composed photographs spread across these pages. "Were you scared?" Susan asks, turning to the photograph of Eleanor in her veil, her father's hand lifting it back from her face, captured forever in Mr. Schaefer's careful composition. "Did you really want to marry Dad, or did you feel like you had to?" Eleanor sits with the question for a long moment before answering, longer than feels entirely comfortable. Susan watching her mother's face with the particular patient attention of a daughter who senses she is about to receive something true rather than something simply reassuring. "Both," Eleanor says finally, which is, I think, as honest an answer as this story has earned by this point. 25 years and a genuinely good marriage and 4 children later. I was terrified, and I did want to marry him, more than I think I let myself admit at the time, because admitting it felt like giving something up, some other version of my life I never actually got to try. But I was scared too. Nobody told me anything really about what any of it would actually be like. Not the wedding night, not the loneliness those first months, not how strange it would feel to answer to a different name. I figured all of it out as I went, mostly alone, the way I think most women my age did. Susan is quiet for a moment, absorbing this, the kitchen around them warm with late afternoon light, and then she asks the question Eleanor has, in some sense, been waiting 25 years for someone to ask her directly. "Why didn't anyone tell you? Why did everyone just let you figure it out alone like that?" Eleanor considers this carefully too, turning the question over, because it deserves a real answer rather than a quick, comfortable one. "I don't think anyone meant any harm by it," she says eventually. "I think everyone genuinely believed they were protecting us, in their own way. My mother had been told even less than she told me. Her mother had been told less still. Each generation thought it was doing better than the one before it, a little more honest, a little more prepared, and maybe each one genuinely was, just slightly, even if it never felt like quite enough from the inside. But there was something in that whole way of thinking that made it nearly impossible to say the actual hard things out loud. We were all so busy making sure the day looked right, making sure everyone behaved properly, making sure nobody embarrassed the family, that there was hardly any room left over for honesty. I don't think it was unkindness exactly. I think it was fear mostly, dressed up as propriety. This conversation happening in 1978 represents something genuinely new in the long unbroken chain of women passing down, or failing to pass down, honest preparation to their daughters. Susan's own wedding, the following spring, will look different from her mother's in ways both women can already sense. Even if neither fully anticipates exactly how different, there will be more honest conversation beforehand, more genuine choice in nearly every element of the day, considerably less rigid enforcement of the old etiquette codes that governed Eleanor's wedding so completely. Susan will keep her own surname for several years after marrying, an option that would have been almost unthinkable in Eleanor's town in 1953, would have generated a particular kind of scandalized commentary at every church social for months afterward. The world is shifting, slowly, generationally, the rigid architecture of 1950s wedding culture giving way, gradually, to something looser, messier, in many ways more honest, even if it carries its own new complications that Eleanor's generation never had to face. But I do not want this story to end by simply congratulating the present for having improved upon the past, because that framing, satisfying as it might feel, misses something important about what Eleanor actually built within the constraints she was given. Sitting at that kitchen table in 1978, 25 years into a marriage built more on duty and steady accumulating affection than on the dramatic romantic love her younger self once imagined, Eleanor has constructed something genuinely valuable, genuinely hers, even within a system that offered her very little voice in its initial construction. The marriage she and Walter built, season by season, ordinary evening by ordinary evening, the quiet companionship of newspaper and mending shared in a small front room, the slow accumulation of trust earned through 1,000 small unwitnessed kindnesses rather than performed for any audience, this represents its own genuine form of resilience, its own genuine achievement, even if the culture surrounding her never had adequate language to describe it as such. It is worth pausing before we move toward closing this story on why June itself mattered so much to weddings of this era, why Eleanor's particular morning fell where it did on the calendar rather than in some other season entirely. The June bride was already, by 1953, a well-established cultural fixture, advertised relentlessly in the bridal magazines that filled racks at the drugstore each spring, and the reasons behind the tradition were a curious blend of the practical and the half-remembered superstitious, some of it traced back to old agricultural rhythms, June arriving conveniently between spring planting and the heavier labor of summer harvest, a rare pocket of relative calm in a farming community's calendar when a family could reasonably spare the time and resources a proper wedding demanded. Some of it traced back further still, to old folk belief tying June to the Roman goddess Juno, patroness of marriage and childbirth, a connection few of the women filling pews in Eleanor's church that morning would have consciously known, though the cultural residue of it lingered anyway, the way old beliefs so often do, stripped of their original context but somehow still shaping behavior generations later. There was a more immediate, practical logic at work too, one Eleanor's own mother mentioned more than once during the planning. June weather in this part of the Midwest was reasonably reliable, warm enough for the outdoor photographs everyone wanted, not yet burdened with the oppressive, humid heat that would arrive by late July and make a formal wedding dress and genuine endurance test rather than simply an uncomfortable one. School was out by June, freeing up the considerable number of young relatives and friends who might otherwise have been unavailable to attend or to stand up in the wedding party. and a June wedding allowed 9 months should a couple wish to plan their family in the conventional, expected rhythm for a first child to arrive comfortably within the following year, a piece of practical arithmetic that a surprising number of mothers, including Ruth, quietly factored into their daughter's wedding date discussions without ever stating the calculation outright. Eleanor had not chosen June for any of these particular reasons, not consciously. She and Walter had simply settled on the date that worked best around his vacation allowance at the plant and the church calendar's availability, a far more mundane set of practical constraints than the romantic folklore surrounding June weddings might suggest. But she benefited from the tradition regardless, married under a cultural umbrella of approval and established expectation that smoothed her path in countless small ways she likely never fully registered. The flowers more readily available and less expensive than they would have been in February, the warm evening allowing the reception to spill comfortably out onto the church lawn for a portion of the afternoon, the whole season seeming to conspire gently in favor of exactly the kind of wedding day her family and her town considered proper and complete. I think about all the Eleanors scattered across the country that same June of 1953, thousands of them, in towns not so different from this one, each lying awake at some version of 4:50 in the morning, doing her own private arithmetic, carrying her own particular blend of hope and fear and quiet resignation down her own particular aisle, toward her own particular stranger waiting at the altar. Most of their names are not recorded anywhere beyond a yellowing newspaper announcement and a fading entry in a county courthouse ledger. Most of their private thoughts on that morning, the actual texture of what it felt like to live through that day rather than simply pose for it, disappeared entirely, the way most ordinary human experience disappears, unrecorded, unremembered beyond the small circle of people who happen to witness it directly, and even within that circle, rarely discussed honestly enough to survive intact for more than a generation or two. What survives, instead, is the photograph. The same photograph, more or less, repeated thousands of times across thousands of towns. The same composed smile, the same careful arrangement of veil and bouquet, the same handful of ritual poses that Mr. Schaefer and photographers exactly like him captured in studio after studio across the country, building collectively an enormous visual archive of 1950s American weddings that looks, from any sufficient distance, remarkably uniform, remarkably serene, remarkably happy. This archive has shaped, in ways worth noticing, an entire popular understanding of what this era's weddings actually were, a soft, nostalgic image of a simpler, more gracious time, brides in their white satin glowing with uncomplicated joy beneath stained glass windows, surrounded by families who loved them and communities who celebrated them. That image is not false exactly. There was real joy in many of these weddings, real love, real community celebration genuinely felt rather than merely performed. But the image is radically incomplete, and the incompleteness matters, because it has allowed an entire generation of women's actual private experience to be quietly replaced in popular memory by a flattering surface that asked nothing difficult of anyone looking at it. We can look at Eleanor's wedding photographs decades later and see only the pretty dress, the handsome groom, the smiling crowd, and feel a comfortable, uncomplicated nostalgia for an era we imagine to have been simpler and gentler than our own. What we cannot see in those same photographs is the 4:50 in the morning arithmetic. We cannot see Dorothy's handkerchief deployed silently in a crowded bedroom to absorb 90 seconds of private tears before the performance resumed. We cannot see the bank teller crossing out a maiden name with bureaucratic indifference, or the careful deflecting answer Eleanor learned to give whenever someone asked about children, or the genuine fear and genuine tenderness tangled together in a hotel room above a dark lake, worked through by two young people with almost no honest preparation for what awaited them there. This is, I think, the real story this entire night has been trying to tell you, underneath all the specific historical detail about courtship customs and etiquette manuals and the architecture of the wedding ceremony itself. Not that 1953 was a uniquely difficult or unkind era for women, because I do not think that framing is quite right either, every era carrying its own particular blend of constraint and possibility for the women living through it. The real story is simpler and I think more universally true than that. It is that the official, photographed, remembered version of any significant day in a woman's life has historically captured only the smallest fraction of what that day actually contained, and that an enormous amount of genuine human experience, fear, grief, quiet resilience, private negotiation, the unglamorous daily labor of building something real within whatever constraints you happen to be given, has simply gone unrecorded generation after generation, leaving behind only the smiling photograph, the careful surface, the version of events polished enough for the mantelpiece. Think of how many such mantelpieces exist, scattered across how many countries, how many decades, how many quiet sitting rooms where a framed photograph has sat undisturbed for so long that the family living around it has nearly stopped seeing it at all. Each one a doorway, really, into some other version of this exact same story, some other Eleanor, some other June morning, some other young woman doing her own private arithmetic in her own particular dark. Eleanor's actual achievement, looking back at it now from this distance, was never really about surviving the wedding day itself, demanding as that single day genuinely was. Her achievement was everything that came after it, the quiet, unwitnessed work of building a genuine marriage, a genuine self, a genuine life within a system that offered her remarkably little voice in its design, and remarkably little honest preparation for its actual demands. She did this not through dramatic resistance or visible rebellion, the kind of story that makes for compelling, easily told history, but through something quieter and in its own way considerably harder to sustain over decades. Patient, daily, largely invisible adaptation, finding genuine value and genuine connection within constraints she did not choose and could not, in any practical sense, escape. I find myself thinking, finishing this story tonight, about how many similar stories exist, unrecorded, behind how many other photographs sitting right now in boxes and albums and frames in houses all over the world. Your own grandmother's wedding photograph, perhaps, or your great-aunt's smiling out at you from some yellowed page. The actual texture of what that day felt like to live through long since vanished beyond recovery, leaving only the careful, composed surface behind. There is something worth sitting with in that thought, something worth carrying gently into sleep tonight, not as a sad thought exactly, though it carries its own particular kind of sadness, but as a kind of quiet honoring, an acknowledgement that the women in those old photographs were never simply the smiling, composed figures the camera captured. They were entire, complicated, frightened, hopeful, resilient people, living through days far more difficult and far more interesting than any single photograph could ever show. There is one part of the lead-up to Eleanor's wedding I have not yet told you about, something that happened several weeks before the ceremony itself, quietly in the small office attached to the church, a meeting that carried its own particular weight even though it generated no photographs, no etiquette column commentary, nothing that would survive in any album. Reverend Whitfield, who has served this congregation for nearly 20 years and will perform the ceremony in a few weeks' time, required, as most ministers of his denomination did during this period, a series of premarital counseling sessions before he would agree to officiate, a tradition rooted partly in genuine pastoral concern and partly in the church's broader institutional role as gatekeeper and validator of respectable marriages within the community. Eleanor and Walter sat together in that small office on 3 separate occasions that spring. Reverend Whitfield asking questions that ranged from the practical. Had they discussed how they intended to manage finances? Did they share compatible expectations about church attendance and the religious upbringing of any future children? To the more philosophical questions about commitment and partnership and the particular Christian understanding of marriage as a covenant rather than simply a contract, a distinction the Reverend clearly considered important and returned to more than once across the 3 sessions. There was notably almost nothing in these sessions addressing the physical or emotional dimensions of marriage with any real specificity, the conversation remaining largely in the register of values and intentions rather than practical preparation. One more instance of this entire culture's tendency to discuss marriage extensively in the abstract, while saying remarkably little about its lived embodied particulars. What I find most interesting about these sessions, thinking about them now, is the institutional weight they carried beyond their stated pastoral purpose. A minister's willingness to perform a wedding functioned, in a town like this one, as a kind of formal community endorsement, a signal to the broader congregation that this match had been examined and found acceptable by the church's own standards. Reverend Whitfield was not simply preparing Eleanor and Walter spiritually for marriage. He was in some sense vouching for them, lending the institutional authority of the church to validate their union in the eyes of a community that took such validation seriously. A couple the minister had genuine reservations about, perhaps because of a significant age gap, or a difference in religious background, or some other factor the community might view with concern, could find themselves facing real obstacles to securing a church wedding at all, pushed instead toward a smaller civil ceremony that carried, in the social calculus of this era, noticeably less prestige and acceptance than a proper church wedding conducted by a respected local minister. Family approval operated alongside this institutional church approval as a second, equally significant gatekeeping mechanism, one we have already touched on through Walter's conversation with Eleanor's father, but which deserves a bit more attention here because it shaped so much of how courtship actually unfolded in towns like this one. A young man courting a young woman in this period was in effect courting her entire family simultaneously. His behavior at Sunday dinners and church functions, under continuous, if good-natured, evaluation by parents who understood themselves to hold genuine veto power over their daughter's eventual choice, even if that veto power was rarely exercised in any dramatic, explicit fashion. Most families like Eleanor's simply allowed approval or disapproval to express itself through smaller, cumulative signals, warmth or coolness in how a young man was received, the frequency or infrequency of invitations to family gatherings, the tone of a father's eventual blessing when a proposal was formally sought. This dual system of church and family approval meant that a young woman's actual choice of husband, while nominally her own decision, operated within a fairly narrow corridor shaped by what her family and her congregation considered acceptable, a corridor that excluded in practice a great many possibilities that might have existed for her in a different social environment. A young man from a different denomination, a different class background, a different racial or ethnic community, faced often insurmountable obstacles to courting a young woman like Eleanor, obstacles that operated less through explicit prohibition than through the accumulated weight of social discomfort, family disapproval, and institutional gatekeeping that made such matches, while not strictly illegal in most cases, practically and socially very difficult to pursue successfully in a town of this size and character. I raise this not to suggest that Eleanor's choice of Walter was somehow coerced or inauthentic, because within the corridor available to her she made a genuine choice, weighed real considerations, felt genuine affection growing into something more substantial over their 14 months of courtship. But it is worth being honest about how narrow that corridor actually was, how much of what felt from the inside like free individual choice was actually being shaped, continuously and largely invisibly, by institutional and familial structures designed to channel young women's romantic lives toward outcomes the broader community considered safe, appropriate, and socially reproducing of its own existing patterns. The wedding invitations themselves, sent out 6 weeks before the ceremony, followed their own precise etiquette, each one addressed by hand in Ruth's careful script, the wording itself governed by convention down to the smallest detail, the names of the hosting parents listed first, traditionally the bride's parents, since they were understood to be formally hosting the occasion, followed by the request of the honor of your presence for a religious ceremony, or the pleasure of your company for a less formal one, language Eleanor and Ruth debated for some time before settling on the more formal phrasing, appropriate to a full church wedding. Response cards were not yet the universal standard they would become in later decades, and guests were expected instead to respond by personal note, a small additional courtesy that placed its own burden on the invited, requiring them to compose by hand a brief acceptance or regret in proper form. One more small thread in the elaborate web of correspondence and etiquette that surrounded even the earliest stages of wedding planning. I want to say a little more about the women who stood beside Eleanor that day, Dorothy and Marjorie, because their own role in the wedding carried its own quiet weight that deserves acknowledgement before this story moves toward its close. Bridesmaids in this era were expected, by an etiquette nearly as rigid as everything else governing the day, to dress identically or nearly so, in dresses chosen by the bride and typically paid for by the bridesmaids themselves, a financial obligation that fell, without much public discussion, on young women who were often, like Dorothy and Marjorie, not especially well off, working their own modest jobs at the telephone exchange and the five and dime, setting aside a portion of several paychecks to cover the cost of a pale blue gown they would, in all likelihood, never wear again for any other occasion. This was simply understood as part of the role, the honor of standing up at a close friend's wedding, carrying with it a real, if rarely discussed, financial cost that the bridesmaid was expected to absorb cheerfully, without complaint, because complaining about it would have suggested a stinginess of spirit considered unbecoming in a good friend. Dorothy mentioned the cost to Eleanor only once in passing, months before the wedding, a brief, light comment about needing to skip her usual Saturday picture show for a few weeks to cover the dress, offered with a small laugh that asked for no sympathy and received none, because both women understood, without needing to discuss it further, that this was simply the unspoken price of friendship at this particular life stage, paid willingly, even gladly, but paid nonetheless. The matching dresses themselves served a specific visual function within the wedding's overall choreography, a deliberate contrast designed to make the bride, in her singular white or ivory gown, stand out clearly from her attendants, the uniformity of the bridesmaids' identical dresses working almost like a frame around the central image of the bride herself. Mr. Schaefer, photographing the wedding party that morning before the ceremony, arranged Dorothy and Marjorie carefully on either side of Eleanor, instructing them on posture and expression with the same exacting attention he gave the bride, because these photographs too would matter, would be studied later, included in the album, shown to children and grandchildren as a record of who had stood closest to Eleanor on this significant day. The album itself, assembled in the weeks following the wedding, represented its own small project, Eleanor and Ruth working together over several evenings to select which of Mr. Schaefer's photographs would make the final cut, arranging them in careful chronological sequence, the formal portraits first, then the ceremony itself, then the reception, the cake cutting, the departure, each photograph mounted behind small black paper corners on heavy black pages, a caption sometimes added beneath in Eleanor's own careful hand, the date, the names of those pictured, small annotations that would prove invaluable decades later, when memory alone could no longer reliably supply such details. This album, more than almost any other single object from the day, would go on to outlive nearly everyone pictured within it, surviving Eleanor's own lifetime, passed eventually to Susan, then to Susan's own children, a physical artifact carrying forward, across generations, the carefully curated visual record of a day whose actual emotional texture, as we have spent this entire evening exploring together, extended so very far beyond what any photograph, however carefully composed, could ever fully capture or preserve. Let us come back now to that hotel room above the dark lake, to the end of that first long day, because there is a particular image from it that I want to leave you with before we let this story rest. It is very late, past midnight, and Eleanor lies awake again, the way she lay awake at 4:50 this same morning, in a different bed, in a different life, except that everything about the quality of her wakefulness has changed in the intervening 18 or so hours. Walter sleeps beside her now, his breathing slow and even, one arm draped loosely across the white chenille spread, and Eleanor lies still beside him, listening to the small sounds of the lake outside the window, the gentle, repetitive lap of water against the dock, a sound she suspects she could grow to love, given enough nights to listen to it. She thinks, lying there, about the whole long architecture of the day just finished, the dress, the veil, the careful walk down the aisle, the receiving line, the cake, the train, the small unguarded moments of genuine laughter scattered throughout it all like coins dropped along a path, each one small and bright and worth, she suspects, picking up and keeping somewhere safe, somewhere she can find them again on harder days still ahead of her, days she cannot yet see from here but which she somehow already senses are coming, the way every life eventually brings them. She thinks about her mother's note in the icebox waiting for her at home, about Dorothy's handkerchief, about her father's damp eyes at the car, about all the small private kindnesses that ran underneath the day's public performance, sustaining her through it even when the performance itself felt nearly unbearable. She thinks too about everything nobody told her, the wedding night's particular blend of fear and tenderness now behind her, worked through, imperfectly but genuinely, alongside a man who turned out to be gentler than she had any real reason to expect, given how little either of them had actually been taught about gentleness in this specific context. There is no single clean conclusion to reach here. Lying awake in this unfamiliar bed above this unfamiliar lake, Eleanor does not arrive, in this quiet midnight hour, at some tidy realization that resolves everything she has been carrying since dawn. What she arrives at instead, I think, is something quieter and more honest than resolution, a simple settling recognition that she has survived the day, that she is, against the considerable weight of everything this single day demanded of her, still fundamentally herself, still the same young woman who likes resolving library books and picking the crusts off her toast, even now wrapped inside the new name and the new role, and the new expectations the day has formally conferred on her. This, I think, is worth naming clearly because it is easy, telling a story like this one, to let the difficulty and the silence and the constraint overshadow the genuine strength running underneath all of it. Eleanor was never simply a passive vessel for her culture's expectations, however completely those expectations shaped the visible architecture of her day. She brought herself into every hour of it, her own particular humor, her own particular tenderness, her own particular resilience, finding small pockets of genuine agency even within a day designed, in so many ways, to manage and contain rather than to liberate her. The 90 seconds of tears Dorothy helped her hide, the genuine laughter on the train with the stolen almonds, the quiet, deliberate choice, lying here now in this hotel bed, to notice and value the gentleness Walter has shown her, rather than simply the fear she carried into this room. These were her own choices, made within enormously narrow constraints, but choices nonetheless, and I think they deserve to be recognized as such, as a genuine form of resilience rather than simply survival. She falls asleep eventually, somewhere past 1 in the morning, the lake still lapping gently against its dock below the window, and in the morning, when she wakes again to that strange reflected light moving across the ceiling, something in her has settled further still, the events of yesterday already beginning their long, slow transformation from lived experience into memory, the particular texture of how it actually felt already starting to soften, the way memory always softens experience, eventually, given enough years and enough retelling. This is in its own way the great unfairness this story has been circling all night, and the great mercy too, both at once. The unfairness is that so much of what Eleanor actually lived through that day will eventually be lost, smoothed over by the comfortable, composed photographs, replaced in memory and in family legend by the simpler, prettier version of events that gets told at anniversary dinners for the next several decades. The mercy is that this same softening process is what allows a person to carry forward, that even Eleanor herself, telling Susan the truth at that kitchen table 25 years later, will find that the sharpest edges of her own fear and uncertainty have genuinely dulled with time, that what remains mostly is something closer to tenderness for her younger self, for the frightened, hopeful young woman who got up in the dark that June morning and somehow, through it all, found her way to something genuinely good on the other side of it. I think about Eleanor's life continuing on, past the point where this particular story has chosen to stop looking, because of course it did continue for decades more, through the ordinary accumulation of seasons and small crises and small joys that make up any long marriage. The kind of accumulation no single day, however carefully documented, could ever hope to capture in full. There were 4 children eventually born across the following decade, each birth its own enormous life-altering event that this story does not have room to properly hold tonight, each one reshaping the household on Linden Street, and then, later, the larger house they moved into as Walter's position improved. There were difficult years too, somewhere in the middle of the 1960s, when Walter was laid off briefly during a slow period at the plant, and Eleanor found herself managing a household budget stretched thinner than it had ever been stretched before, drawing on a kind of practical resourcefulness she had been quietly developing without quite realizing it, since those very first uncertain mornings in her own new kitchen. There were good years too, plenty of them, ordinary Tuesday evenings and Sunday dinners and summer vacations to the same lake town, eventually, where they had honeymooned, returning there several times over the decades with their own growing children in tow. Eleanor watching her own daughters splash in the same water she once watched from a hotel porch as a frightened, hopeful 22-year-old, the same dock, the same gentle lapping sound against it, decades apart, and somehow not so far apart at all. Walter died in 1991 after 38 years of marriage, and Eleanor, widowed at 60, found herself surprised by the particular shape of her grief, surprised by how much she missed the small, unremarkable daily rhythms of their shared life together far more than she missed any grand romantic gesture, because there had been remarkably few of those across 38 years, and remarkably much of the other kind instead, the quiet, accumulated intimacy of 2 people who had genuinely learned over decades how to share a single life well, how to read a silence correctly, how to sit together in a small front room without needing to fill the quiet with anything at all. I do not know honestly whether Eleanor would describe her own life, looking back at the very end of it, as a happy one. I suspect she would say something more complicated than that, something closer to what she told Susan at the kitchen table that afternoon in 1978, that it was both the fear and the genuine contentment both true at once, the constrained choices and the real love both somehow coexisting within the single life she actually got to live, rather than the other life, the unmarried librarian's life, that she occasionally still wondered about, quietly, privately, on certain late evenings when the house was very quiet, and the children, grown now, were off living their own separate lives elsewhere. This is, I think, finally the truest thing this story can offer you tonight, lying there in your own dark room, wherever you happen to be tonight, listening to a voice telling you about a wedding day that happened 70-some years ago to a woman who never existed exactly as I have described her, though thousands of women very much like her existed in towns across this entire country in that same June. Lives are rarely simple enough to sort cleanly into happy or unhappy, fortunate or unfortunate, free or constrained. Most lives, examined closely enough, contain genuine versions of all of these things at once, woven together in ways that resist the simple composed photograph, the tidy anniversary toast, the comfortable nostalgic narrative that lets us look back on any era and imagine it as simpler or kinder than the one we are currently living through ourselves. What I hope you carry with you drifting off now is not a sad feeling about Eleanor or about the countless real women whose actual lives her story is standing in for tonight. I hope you carry something closer to a quiet, genuine respect, the kind you might feel for someone who did something difficult well, without much acknowledgement, without much choice in the matter, and built something genuinely valuable anyway, inside constraints she never chose and could not have changed. There is real dignity in that, I think. A dignity history has not always been generous enough to recognize, busy as it tends to be with louder, more dramatic stories. Battles and elections and famous men doing famous things in well-documented rooms. The quieter story, the one happening simultaneously in 10,000 kitchens and 10,000 bedrooms and 10,000 small-town churches, the story of ordinary women living through ordinary days with extraordinary, largely unrecognized resilience, deserves its own place in how we remember this era, alongside everything else we already know about it. Eleanor woke at 4:50 that June morning, frightened and uncertain, and by the time she finally slept again, many hours later, above a quiet lake, something in her had not broken, had not even really bent all that much, had simply absorbed an enormous day and kept going, kept being herself underneath all of it, kept finding small pockets of genuine warmth and genuine choice even within a day that offered her so very little formal voice in its own design. That is the story I wanted to leave with you tonight. Not the photograph version, not the anniversary toast version, but the real one, or as close to the real one as a story built from research and imagination and genuine care can manage to get, all these decades later, reaching back toward a woman who lived a whole complicated, ordinary, resilient life that mostly went unrecorded, the way most lives do. So let the room go quiet now. Let the lake settle back into stillness behind that hotel window, the small waves slowing, until the water lies flat and dark and silent beneath a sky full of June stars neither Eleanor nor Walter will remember clearly enough to describe to anyone, years later, though they will both remember, vaguely, warmly, that the stars were out that first night, bright and close in a way they never quite seemed at home. Let the dress go back into its tissue paper, folded carefully, the satin cool and smooth under careful hands, packed away into the box where it will wait, patiently, for years, for decades, taken out perhaps only twice more in Eleanor's lifetime, once to be shown to Susan before her own wedding, once, much later, simply to be touched again briefly by an old woman remembering a particular June morning that feels by then like it happened to someone else entirely, someone she still recognizes somehow underneath all the intervening years. Outside, let the cans tied to the back of that car go quiet too, their rattling clatter fading now into the soft, settled silence of a night long since arrived at its destination. The car parked now outside a small lake hotel, the cans hanging still and silent in the dark, waiting for morning, for the drive home, for the slow unwinding of an entire elaborate day back into the ordinary rhythm of ordinary life. Let the kitchen on Maple Street go dark too, the percolator cooling on the stove, Ruth finally sitting down herself, late, after everyone else has gone, after the dishes from the reception have been washed and dried and put carefully away by a small army of aunts and cousins, sitting alone for a few minutes in her own quiet kitchen, looking, perhaps, at the small space at the table where her daughter sat for breakfast that same morning, a chair that will not sit empty exactly, not with Carol still at home, not with Sunday dinners still ahead, but different now, the particular shape of the family permanently and quietly altered, far away. Let the church go dark and silent too, the fellowship hall swept clean by now, the long tables folded and stacked along the wall, the white clothes gathered up for washing, the building settling back into its ordinary Tuesday through Saturday quiet, waiting for the next Sunday service, the next wedding, the next christening, the whole slow cycle of small-town religious life continuing on, indifferent, in its patient way, to any single day's particular significance. And let Eleanor sleep now too, finally, fully in that narrow hotel bed above the lake. The fear of the morning and the performance of the afternoon and the uncertainty of the evening all folded now into something quieter, something closer to simple, ordinary tiredness, the kind that comes after any long, significant day, regardless of what that day contained. She sleeps without dreaming, or without remembering her dreams, which amounts by morning to nearly the same thing, and when she wakes, the light moving softly across the ceiling in those shifting reflected patterns, she will not feel particularly like a different person. She will simply feel like herself, tired and a little sore and quietly, cautiously hopeful, beginning the long, ordinary work of an entire married life that stretches out ahead of her now, unphotographed, mostly unrecorded, hers. I want you to notice your own breathing now, the way it has probably slowed somewhat over these last several minutes, the way your own body has likely settled deeper into whatever blanket you pulled around yourself at the start of all this. There is nothing more this story needs from you tonight. No question to answer, no comment to leave, no part of yourself you need to keep alert or composed or watching. You can let all of that go now, the way Eleanor finally let go of the performance of her own long day, the way the lake outside that hotel window let go of its small waves and settled into stillness. Think, if you like, of your own grandmother, or your own mother, or some other woman whose wedding photograph sits somewhere in your own family's keeping, smiling out from some yellowed page in a way that captures only the smallest fraction of who she actually was, what she actually carried, what she actually came through to arrive at that particular smile on that particular day. You do not need to know her whole story to honor it. You only need to remember, drifting off now, that there was a whole complicated, resilient, largely unrecorded story underneath that careful photograph, the way there was for Eleanor, the way there has been for nearly every woman in nearly every old photograph in nearly every family's keeping. The night is settling in properly now, around you, around this story, around all the small rooms and dark lakes and quiet kitchens we have spent these last few hours moving through together. Let your shoulders drop a little further. Let your hands go loose and heavy wherever they are resting. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Nothing else you need to figure out. No arithmetic left to do in the dark. Eleanor is asleep now, above her quiet lake, the cans silent on the car outside, the dress folded safely away, the whole long day finally completely behind her. Somewhere a screen door settles softly against its frame. Somewhere a porch light clicks off for the night. The whole small town she left this morning is sleeping too, ordinary and unremarkable, and entirely unaware that anything significant happened there at all today, beyond one more wedding, one more ordinary Saturday, one more young woman folded quietly into a story too large and too common to draw any special notice. And you can sleep now too. Rest well. Let the dark hold you the way it held Eleanor that night above the lake, gently, without demand, without anything left to perform. I will be here again tomorrow night, with another story, another quiet room, another life worth sitting with for a while in the dark. Until then, sleep deeply and sleep well.